I played Homeworld, Deserts of Kharak, and we're going to look at the best parts of that campaign, and talk about the game in general, I suppose, as we go along. Why am I playing Homeworld, Deserts of Kharak? Well, it's for a simple reason. I played Highfleet somewhat recently, another game with a desert in it that you don't really need to know about, but essentially, a lot of the thoughts I had about Highfleet were, you should change this, you should change that, and what I was describing in like what I wanted Highfleet to be like was Homeworld, Deserts of Kharak, and that kind of reminded me that I owned it and had never played it, and brought me here. So specifically, I was looking for a game where you drive a giant vehicle around a desert, and that, I guess, is what this game is like, to some extent. It's also kind of a strategy game like Highfleet. Well, it is a strategy game, I don't know why I'm saying kind of. I was more interested in the giant thing driving around. It's almost not clear how giant this is. Like, the mountains around it are pretty big. This thing's pretty big as well. It very rarely shows you like the scale of things in this game. Occasionally you'll see like a cutscene where the smallest vehicle in the game is put next to a person standing beside it who is like a tenth of the size of the tire or something like that. It's about giant vehicles driving around a desert. And in that regard, it's cooler than Highfleet. But I guess these are games we're comparing, so what exactly is the game involved? Like, I'm interested in the setting here. What are we doing? Well, here are a bunch of cars driving into some other cars and shooting each other. It's Homeworld. It's a prequel to Homeworld, so I'm going to vaguely assume you vaguely know what Homeworld is. I guess if you don't, it's an old RTS. It was a space RTS, so here it's an interesting step where, to make the prequel to that game, they've made a game that is kind of more simple, you could say, in that it's an on-land RTS, which in practice is almost exactly the same, but the kind of feel or scale is reduced. Like, it feels less like you have freedom and there's cool stuff going on because it's happening in 2D and we're not like flying spaceships around in space, we're driving cars around a desert. But in terms of pure mechanics, it's really identical. Especially because in Homeworld, while it was in 3D, the action kind of took place in 2D in that it was presented as 2D slices of a cylinder which you could go up and down in. It doesn't matter. I can imagine people automatically disliking this if you're a fan of Homeworld, because it doesn't have that 3D in-space aspect, but I insist to you that really this gameplay is the same sort of thing. A lot of the gameplay is focused on taking your units and dividing them into groups and using them to get good matchups with the enemy things, like there are lots of units with hard counters to each other. We'll see, of course, as we go along. This was just the tutorial we're looking at now, where it gives you a couple of units and you drive around. A decent tutorial. It only shows you the beginning of the tech tree, so like the initial units you'll have early in the game, but it tells you enough to learn the game pretty quickly. I liked it, although because I'm coming from the background of vaguely knowing what Homeworld is already, and it has the same controls and same general style of gameplay, maybe I can't really comment on the tutorial properly because of that. We're getting into the main game, where somebody is getting into a giant car in the desert. The vague premise of this game is that if you have played Homeworld, right at the very beginning it says something like, we discovered a giant spaceship in the desert and that's how we're going out into space for the first time to look for our homeworld. And this is that story that was very briefly mentioned at the beginning of Homeworld. We have detected that there's some kind of unknown thing hidden beneath the deserts of Kharak, and we're going to drive to the other side of the planet to go and look at what it is, but we already know what it is if you've played the games that came out in the past. It's a giant spaceship, so this is the origin story of that series of games, essentially. And the idea is very similar, where instead of a mothership in space, you have the carrier in the desert, which very much is the same thing gameplay-wise, as hopefully I'll convince you as we go along, if you need convincing at all. But really, the thing about this game is the same thing about the original Homeworld, which is that I think the gameplay is just sort of fine. The real reason the game stands out is its presentation and its aesthetic and its mood. This is by far the best thing about this game, and that's why I think the game needs more to it, really. Like, it feels like it's a shame that this franchise is so small, because it presents itself in such a different way to other RTSs. Specifically what it does is it's incredibly dour and slow and atmospheric. Like, for example, here we have the captain of our ship, who doesn't even get a name despite being one of the main characters. Only one of the several main characters even gets a name. And all of the characters speak in a very subdued sort of way. This guy's trying to give his dramatic speech to the crew as we set off in search of the thing. We'll have to drive through enemy territory. We don't really know what that means, but it doesn't matter too much. I don't know. It feels like it really presents itself in a completely down-to-earth way. It's so down-to-earth and undramatic in the way it presents itself. It's just like, this is just our job. Like for the character, all the characters in the game are just doing their 9-to-5 job, going through the motions of going on an epic journey because they have to. And there's something really interesting about that presentation, I think. I loved the way it constantly kind of stops the plot to just have loads of like chatter between the units, and like earlier you might have seen the dialogue was just talking about how open the gate was as it was going through the gate and they were waiting for it to open. Such a sort of realistic presentation of like having a gigantic super vehicle drive out of a gate. You'd probably just be talking about the details and the safety concerns of doing so. I like how formulaic and by the book everybody in your faction is at the very least. Here we're looking at somebody talking to us from the other faction, the Galcian, who are going to try and stop us going to the thing. The reason they don't like us is because they are religiously against going into space. And I guess they already know that this thing is a spaceship. So they hate us for one reason or another. I don't remember how much our characters know about why the enemy hate us. Annoyingly, the thing we're looking for is like slap bang in the middle of the place that they own on this deserty planet. So we have to just drive right through their territory to get there. It's going to be a hassle. Therefore, there's going to be a game. We'll have to play that hassle and try to keep our carrier and its various strike groups alive as we drive somewhere. If you're looking closely at the cutscenes or just listening to the chatter throughout the game, both in the cutscenes and in like random moments, so when you select units they talk to each other, or sometimes you can just hear your units talking to each other in the background. I had it down very quiet as I played through because I always turn voices down when I'm recording so I can talk over it with my voice. But when you're playing, there are voices better than mine talking about interesting topics. Unfortunately, we cannot provide that in this commentary. But the one thing I wanted to say is that this impression that the game has this strong aesthetic, has a cool vibe, and more broadly speaking, just a cool lore setup, a cool scenario, a cool world. That was also my takeaway from playing through the original Homeworld, of which there is a video similar to this on this channel, where I essentially concluded that I thought the lore and the world was really interesting, and it didn't use it enough. And essentially that's going to be my conclusion for this game. I'm just going to point the exact same thing here and say, the setup is so interesting. I mean, the characters should have names, for starters. There should be much more delivered to the player. I don't know if they thought about it or whether they wanted to keep it really minimalist. The world seems really deep in terms of its design and its lore, and from what I know of the wider Homeworld lore, there is a lot more to it than the game tells you about. So one example could be, I mentioned that other faction who hate space travel, or they're religiously against space travel. For some reason they really don't want people going to space because it's against some sort of proclamation in their religion. But of course, if you happen to know the deep lore that this game, I don't think ever mentions, your civilization is here on this planet as some sort of punishment for a crime that you did. I can't remember what it is. And you really are forbidden from going to space, like as part of a kind of prison sentence from a wider human empire that we have forgotten exists at some point. Like this happened a long time ago, we were banished to this planet. We don't know we're part of a wider empire, and they are monitoring us, and they will kill us if we try to leave. And that's why one faction has this religion based around never leaving the planet. It's kind of a corruption of what the original inhabitants of the planet might have understood to be their purpose for being here. And I find that sort of topic really interesting. This is never mentioned in the game, I think. It's not even hinted at as far as I know. Our characters don't question the enemy religion, we don't talk to them, we don't know who they are. They occasionally talk to us, telling us that we will die if we leave the planet. And occasionally we notice that our planet does for some reason happen to be covered in crashed spaceships all over the place, and that there's some sort of implication there that there was a precursor civilization and that for some reason they crash here a lot. And it's weird how all of these ships appeared to be coming to this planet before suddenly being destroyed and crashing here, or something like that. This is mentioned in the plot, just in passing, and isn't delved into at all. Your characters aren't really very interested in this, they're just doing their job. And, I don't know, it feels like there's loads of missed lore potential It's a hard thing to commentate on because, again, once again, in an off-ED commentary, I'm just gesturing at something that I'm not showing in the game because it's not in the game. Just talking about what the game is not, that's my specialty really. And what the game is not is an interesting exploration of the Homeworld universe. It just sort of touches upon it. It even touches upon it less than the previous game where I was complaining that it didn't touch upon it enough. So there is some really interesting lore, I think, around this game. You just won't get it from playing the game. That said, what the game does present is done extremely beautifully and moodily, and I really liked the cutscenes, essentially, and it's just when the characters talk to each other. Give them first names. Give them a name. How about that? Give them a name. I think the only named character, the Rachel Sajette, who is labelled on the screen for most of the game, is a relative of one of the only characters who is named in Homeworld. There's someone called Karen Sajette in Homeworld, who I think is like the voiceover or something. So one of the only characters in that game is possibly a relative of one of the only characters in this game. So there you go. There's a link between the games in some way. Feels like there was a lot more to do there and a lot of potential left on the table. Well, let's stop talking about what the game isn't as usual and try to talk about what it is. Is what is on the table interesting enough to play? Well, clearly it is, because I played through the whole thing and this was a game where I wanted to play it. Another legendary off-ED accolade to provide. I wasn't just playing it because I wanted to complain about it, or I felt like I was forced to play it just to get footage of it so I could then show the footage and be like, well, I did play the whole thing and it didn't get any better, or something like that. This was a game that I liked playing, and sometimes when I stopped playing I thought, I wish I could have played that a bit more, but it's time to make dinner. Whereas in other games I'm like, well, thank God it's time to make dinner, let's go do something else. So there you go, another high praise stamp for this game. Something about it was good in several ways. Let's try to find out what it was by looking in detail at various things that happened during the campaign. So the moment-to-moment gameplay. It is, to put it in a very annoyingly simple way, match the shapes. We have various triangles here and various squares. The enemy are coming at us with their triangles. The squares are the hard counter to the triangles. The triangles are the hard counter to a sort of pointy square we'll see in a second. And, well, I'm describing it in terms of shapes because we have this sensor view, and this here is the regular view. This brings up a big question right away. Does the game suffer from the sensor view being so damn useful? You'll see throughout this footage, it's a rare thing to encounter a moment when looking at the non-sensor view, looking at the regular view, is a good idea. And that's simply because the sensor view has a way wider field of vision and it's just clearer. So being able to be out here and see the triangles coming in like much earlier versus when you would see them if you were playing in the normal view, this one here. And the solution I'm looking for would be to let you zoom out the normal view as far as you can zoom out the sensor view. I'm guessing they don't do that for performance reasons. But for a different kind of performance reason, my gameplay performance, I feel compelled to stay in this blue view. Just look at everything from the top down, triangles versus squares kind of presentation, which is a shame because the game does look quite good. But a lot of my footage is just of this. This is a similar topic to something I ranted about when I did Total War Pharaoh somewhat recently. Another game that technically looks good, but if you're looking at how good it looks, you're actively losing something about the game because the game happens on a different UI scale, and this is another example of that. So what is happening right here? We're still preparing our carrier to go on this expedition. We're now like on the border, which is under attack. We're collecting together some forces and fighting the various triangles and squares with a pointy bit on the side. That's that thing in the top right firing at me, a railgun. In the triangle of counters, railguns beat armoured units, those are your squares. Armoured units beat light units, those are your triangles, and the light units beat the railguns, the squares with points on the side. They need to be a better to describe shape, really. Let's just call them railguns, shall we? We did a little bit of strategy there, you might have noted, because if you go down to the regular view, you can use the micro-terrain to break line of sight, so there's a bit more strategy versus the old Homeworld stuff in space, because line of sight is taken into account. You can also get height bonuses from firing down upon an enemy. I think it gives you extra damage. But because I'm going to spend most of the game in the sensor view, I'm actually not really going to see the quote-unquote micro-terrain very much. I'm calling it micro-terrain because it's small in comparison to your units, but it's supposed to be massive in the context of the world. It's just hard to notice it a lot of the time. So anyway, we're driving off. It's explaining here that the Capiciar carrier isn't at full capacity, just prepping us so we can have an upgrade system, essentially. There are some things we can upgrade about the carrier as we go along. There's the thing we're looking for, the primary anomaly. It's on the other side of the planet. What planet is this? We don't know, both like as a civilization and the player playing the game as well. That's an issue, I think. But it's not Earth or any such place like that. That's all we know. I believe actually in the lore it does mention somewhere that Kharak used to be not a desert planet, and it's becoming a desert is a recent problem that we're trying to deal with. Not quite sure why it's becoming a desert though. For the next mission we are driving on towards the objective. First we go through some chasms and we pick up various other kinds of triangles off the floor, the orange and blue resources, which are called like Ru and Ku. I never worked out what those letters stand for, so let's just call them Ru and Ku. Basically the orange one is more common than the blue one, and various units require you to have a bit of the blue one to make them, and some don't. So a little bit more complicated than Homeworld there. Now and again that does add to things, but realistically you just want to get all of both as much as possible. There are various things to rant about when it comes to resources in this game, but I'll save that for later. For now, as we drive along, we find a derelict carrier from some sort of previous expedition around here. Rachel goes to check it out, and we have to defend her while she does it. The complication being that there are various places on the map that the Capici, our carrier, can't go to, including, well, where this carrier went to. I think there's quicksand or something. Who knows? We can't go over there. That means we effectively have to defend two things, because your carrier is also your objective for most of the missions, in that you have to not let it die in combat. So if you go away from the carrier, you need to also constantly look back to make sure nothing bad is happening. Which is happening right now, in fact. We're getting some triangles all up in our business around the carrier, and it's instructing me to change the power distribution within the carrier. This is a neat little feature. You can change what the carrier does for all intents and purposes by changing how it's using its power. So now we've got it in armoured mode, it's just going to be a tank, but you could also have it focus more on offense, and it functions as a healer unit as well, but it can't be all of them at the same time, very well at least. So that's interesting. You can mix and match what it's going to do to suit a certain situation. The one thing you're not really supposed to do is use it as a combat unit. You can see I got that impression because if it takes damage, a thing pops up saying it's taking damage, and you get this critical message saying, oh no, the carrier's under attack. The thing is, what I later kind of came to appreciate is that the carrier's a pretty good unit, and if you try to keep it out of combat for the whole game, you're just missing out. So later we'll see me ignoring the risks and using the carrier as a unit because it's one of your best units and you have it the whole time. You might as well use it. You're just leaving stuff on the table. As long as it doesn't die, you'll be fine, and you can repair it after it takes damage, and it has tons of hit points. So I was too cautious for a decent portion of the game, essentially. We eventually finished searching this destroyed carrier. Speaking of carriers getting destroyed, well, I'm sure that won't happen to me. And on it, it had an artifact we can use to upgrade the Capici. Throughout the game, there are various optional wrecks you can investigate to upgrade the Capici to make it better. This first one, though, I think is mandatory, which allows your sensors to see during storms and just makes the sensor view more useful. There's a little example of Rachel and the Capici healing each other. Because they're both healer units, we can heal all of our story-critical stuff and then move on, or not move on as the case may be. So I wanted to rant about one of the big topics that comes to mind, a classic question that often comes up when you're playing RTS campaigns with a scripted element but are also somewhat open-ended. That being, should I do the objective when it tells me to do it? And it's another one of these games where possibly not is the correct answer. Sometimes the reason for that being the case is because doing an objective will cause some sort of scripted bad thing to happen, and you want to prepare for the bad thing as much as possible and ignore any sort of fake time limits that are attached to the idea that you should be doing the objective. So in this case, we're supposed to destroy an enemy production cruiser on the other side of the mountain in front of the Capici there. But what I could also do is send the whole army into the corner because there are some resources, and like in Homeworld you have support cruisers which can take on resources in the same way that the carrier can. So we're just going to do this. We're going to have our little salvage bots or salvage vehicles go and pick up these triangles over here. We can also capture an abandoned railgun and add that to our army. And we want to ideally exhaust everything on the map, use all of the mass's resourcing potential before we start doing objectives, in case that objective is the final objective, because if you leave the map without taking resources, they are gone forever. And this is a point of contention, really. And I remember having a similar discussion in Homeworld. Essentially, in the old Homeworld, at the end of each mission, any resources that your fleet could see but hadn't harvested yet would just be considered to have been automatically harvested, because you could have harvested them, essentially. Like, it doesn't need to make you actually do it. And I was very much in favour of that, although I wanted to have it include all resources on the map, not just the ones you could see, because that wasn't much of an interesting difference, really. You could see anywhere on the map if you wanted to. In Homeworld Deserts of Kharak, it does not work like that. So, you need to harvest the entire map, ideally, before doing an objective, in case it is the final objective of the mission. And occasionally, what the objectives are will sneak up on you, because some missions are divided up into multiple parts. So like something that seems like it's not the final resolution of a conflict will actually end the mission when you do it, and then the next mission will be the final resolution of an ongoing skirmish. So because, as a defense against that, you might want to get all the resources, or not even as a defense against that, you just might even want to get the resources because you'll need them, it does slow things down and cause you to take lots of detours that are sort of ludo-narratively dissonant if you care about that, and I guess are just uninteresting parts of the game that take a surprisingly long time. You might be asking, if you don't know the secret here, why even bother collecting resources at the ends of missions, like when you're not going to use them? You're about to win, right? Why do you need to get more resources? It's because everything is persistent, which is also the most interesting thing, sort of gameplay-wise and design-wise, I think, about Homeworld. All of your resources and all of your units are permanent once you make them, and indeed once you lose them. So, that means the game is, unfortunately, a gigantic positive feedback loop. So, while I'm saying this is the thing that's good about the game, it's also kind of bad from a game design perspective. It's fun from an experience perspective, because it makes sense. That's how real life actually works. Stuff is persistent. So, doing well in early battles will help you out in later battles, because all units you lose permanently. And all resources you've spent permanently. There's a finite amount of stuff in the game, and you have to complete the game with it. That means there's no such thing as like a pointless or meaningless engagement. You have to win the engagements cleanly, you have to pay attention, you have to get the right shapes against the other right shapes in practice. But I contrast this again to something like Total War, where engagements don't matter at all, and you have things like auto-resolves and infinitely replenishing soldiers and things like that. Here, there's a sense that you really are on a campaign with a limited amount of stuff. Although you do have unlimited people, which is quite handy. Like, you can always forever crew new ships as long as you have the resources to build them. This persistency adds a layer of immersion on top of the already quite immersive presentation that I think makes the game really interesting. Like, I found myself very invested in the outcomes of even small, like potentially pointless battles in other RTS games, because they aren't pointless in this game. They're an actual part of your story. If you took a loss fighting one triangle, that is a problem, so you want to make sure you kill one triangle really well. And that's true throughout the entire campaign. It provides a real strength to the feeling of the gameplay, which you don't often get in other games like this. However, it presents this positive feedback loop, where essentially you need to do well all the time to do well later. This is a question of game balance to some extent. They can make it so that there are so many resources in the game that it doesn't matter if you waste them all the time. But when you play, I guess you don't really know if it's going to be like that, so even that has a mitigated effect. Essentially, I knew I needed to play really well, especially in the beginning, and by really well, what I actually mean is getting all of the triangles. So that means really slowly, it means really carefully. That's what well is in this context. Ideally, it means not taking losses in combat. That's like the good part of the positive feedback loops effect. And then the bad part is you have to play everything else as gamely, as metally, as min-maxily as possible, because there are so many advantages to be gained in playing like that. And I'm forced to assume that the developers have balanced the game in some way around you getting those advantages. I don't know if that's the case, but simply the suspicion, the possibility that that's the case, means we're going to play this in an optionally bad way. I'm sort of dancing around the point here because while you could complain that the game forces you to stop and get resources for a long time, quite often, which is happening in this footage, as you can see, I'm not really doing anything, it theoretically is optional, so the developer could say, well, you don't have to stop and get resources, you could just go on the attack and do the objective. But I feel like I would then shoot back and say, yeah, but you've made a game where it's so advantageous to do this boring thing that I feel like I have to do it. So, I don't know. It's just the downside of a positive feedback loop. It's a game where it potentially will be difficult if you don't do well early on. And then the opposite problem also exists, where if you do too well early on, it will be too easy later. Ultimately, that's probably what we're going to be seeing in this video, because things tended to get better and better as we went along, because you're always keeping the results of things going better before. However, switching to the antithesis, the negative feedback loop, would be a problem as well. This is something I ranted about in my Battle for Middle-earth video. In this video, I'm just referring you to all sorts of other rants I've made before, because it's coming up again. The negative feedback loop approach would be to punish the player for doing well, in order to force the balancing to be kept somewhat in check, while still having some sort of persistency in the game. Battle for Middle-earth was an example of a game that did that, in that it got harder and harder to gain any advantage the better you were playing. And another example could be something like XCOM, which does that in secret, in that if you're doing well, the code in the background will just make the enemy stronger without telling you, and will alter the probabilities of things happening such that you will fail a little bit still, and you'll feel like you aren't gaining any kind of snowballing advantage by just forcing you to not gain one, even though the mechanics of the game mean that you should be getting it. And here's a game, Homeworld Deserts of Kharak, the game I'm showing on the screen right now, where you can gain a gigantic, snowbally kind of advantage by playing well. And the only thing I'm vaguely hinting at here is the possibility they could have made it differently so that it went the other way, so that in some way there's a burden or a problem for your army being really big that makes the game harder for players who are good at the game, and that's the negative feedback loop aspect. Which is a bad idea, because it also means that in many cases the best way to play the game is to play suboptimally to try and get the negative feedback loop to run in your favour. Or to put that another way, if playing the game well makes the game harder to try and maintain balance, then in order for the game to be easy, you shouldn't play well. Therefore, good players play badly. And we have a weird situation there, which results from a negative feedback loop design. There's no winning. Games suck. There's just no possible way to make a good video game, I think. Well, anyway, they've had a good stab at it in Homeworld Deserts of Kharak. And the reason I just wasted 10 minutes of your time is because, well, you saw in the footage, the game was wasting 10 minutes of my time, wasn't it? And that's probably the biggest problem with the game, just like it's now become the biggest problem with the quality of this YouTube video. I do like to keep things consistent and not ludonarratively dissonant. Something. Why don't we move on to the action? Hopefully you get my vague point. I'll make it again probably as we go on, so look forward to that. Scientists said it was impossible, but here I am showing you some actual gameplay from the game, or some more interesting gameplay, because the point was, the other stuff is also gameplay, but probably wasn't that fun to look at, also not that fun to play, I guess. We do a little set-piece attack where I send in the light attack craft first to disrupt the enemy's railgun positions, and then things descend into what you might call a dogfight. Yes, the game is theoretically based on the ground, but a lot of the mechanics and the way the fights play out are essentially the same, as in Homeworld, who'd have thunk it, including the fact that your small car-like things, which are very big cars actually, are basically fighters and are represented by the same icons as fighters in Homeworld and have the same AI behaviour. So there's a real crossover there. Feels like people who would have been put off by the fact this isn't a space game perhaps would have been relieved to see that it basically is a space game. It's just on the ground, but that's really of no consequence, the ground aspect. You could just imagine it's not there, and it's a space game. Well anyway, what am I talking about today? Always hard to know. But it turns out that Rachel Sajet has discovered in that wrecked ship a message from her brother, who was an officer aboard that ship. I'm not quite sure what he was doing. They were on some other expedition when their ship was quote-unquote sank, I guess, by sand. Like the sand breached the hull and the ship sunk into the sand. Not quite sure what happened. Some kind of seafaring analogy thing but with sand happened. The point was though, they were heading off because they'd spotted a giant spaceship that's not too far away. So we drive to this giant spaceship. It's not the even gianter spaceship we're looking for, but it's a similar sort of thing, and we can just sort of hang out here and check it out. And I'm not quite sure to what extent we're discovering that spaceships are all over the place. I feel like at some point in the plot, it implies you weren't really aware that the planet is covered in spaceship wrecks, but it totally is, and you should know this already. Like, if we know there's a spaceship wreck on the other side of the planet, the premise of the game, how did we not spot, like, this one and the millions of others that turn out to be everywhere? I think maybe it was like a barely kept secret that most of the Galcian territory has lots of these wrecks and ours doesn't or something, so maybe we weren't really thinking about space travel. I still wonder whether we know we're part of a bigger civilization or not. The point is, it's time for another mission. The first wreck, the big wreck, has a whole bunch of useful triangles, so we'll stay there to pick them up. And there are 3 other locations where bits of the wreck probably are. What the game wants you to do is send out probes to look to see if there is wreckage there. Exactly the sort of thing I was just referring to, but handily, it kind of shot me by because I wasn't paying enough attention. It popped up in the corner saying, use a probe to go and look at those areas. But when it said probe, I kind of thought it meant a scanner, because there's a different thing in the game called a scanner, which is like a stationary probe. A probe being something from Homeworld, if you know that. There is a little unit that travels around and just reveals the map. You can make them in this game, but I didn't discover how to do it for a really long time. Maybe we'll see one later. You don't actually need a probe for the objective, even though it is telling me to do it in the top left, because all 3 of the places you need to check do have something to salvage, and once you see it, you have to deploy a scanner, the static probe, next to it. So doing it the hard way is actually what it was going to tell you to do anyway, therefore this all worked out. Another victory for not really paying attention to what they're saying in the corner. In my defense, once again, I have the voice volume turned down, so it's harder for me to even notice if somebody's saying something to me. Just as true in real life as well. Now, as we deploy these scanners, the enemy show up and start attacking us. So what are we going to do about that? Well, things are a little bit more complicated now because the enemy start deploying groups with mixed shapes. It's like, well, what do you do if the enemy deploys triangles and squares? This group has no hard counter. You need a similarly mixed group of your own. And then you could zoom in and do some micro to make sure the right units are fighting each other. It's just sort of difficult to do because there's probably something else to do, and I tended to do the something else. What is that something else I'm referring to? I'm making some fighters. Basically, I mean like macro stuff rather than micro. So here we see a micro mistake, essentially, in that our force gets split up, racing all over the place. The issue we're having here is that the enemy have production cruisers, which are units that make other units. There's one on the left there, the rhombuses in the sensor view. So ideally, you want to kill them first. So once I spotted one, I started going towards it, but then we're being attacked from all kinds of other directions. There's like 3 or 4 of these production cruisers around the map, making these small groups of mixed shape units, for which there is no ideal counter other than having a mixed shape group yourself. So splitting the army up, which is what I was about to do, probably isn't a very good idea. However, we're also taking a pounding because the carrier is stuck back at the beginning of the stage. We can't reinforce these positions very easily, so as we're fighting out here, we lose all of the light attack craft, and now we're going to be vulnerable to railgun attacks because we have no hard counter to them. And in fact, most of our army is now the thing that is hard countered by them, which we shall see. However, we've also got this little number. We've got strike fighters. Strike fighters are my favourite thing in this game. It's just such a good little addition to the rhythm of combat. Essentially, your carrier can actually work like a carrier in that it can deploy planes. So you can hit F1 and W, I believe the combo is, to deploy a fighter strike onto the mouse position. And this is a really cool little thing to be doing. I just enjoyed the feel of it, where you see vaguely what's happening on the battlefield and just be like, right, we need a fighter strike here, we need one here. And the more fighters you have, the more you can send out at the same time. The fighters will then fight automatically, so it's a fire and forget sort of thing. I do like it being like that. It's something I was talking about in my Supreme Commander video, to make another reference. I like the idea of you making big, high-level macro decisions and having stuff be automated when it comes to carrying them out. So I'm just putting forward what our strategy should be, and then the AI carries it out. It's a tiny bit like that in that the fighters will just sort of fight things in the zone you've sent them to. It's a really nice low micro, high power thing to do, so I think that's why it feels so powerful. Like, you're in the middle of the chaos doing everything else, and then you just be like, right, fighter here, and you know that 10 seconds later something's going to come of that and you can use it. It's quite nice, although we'll also see cases where the fact it's automated can be a problem. First though, look at the graphics on the ground. It's pretty nice. I was looking out here over the wreckage, probably having more Supreme Commander flashbacks about wanting to eat the wreckage, but anyway, the actual point is, that's something that you just don't get very much of in the game, or you quote-unquote shouldn't get very much of, because you quote-unquote should be looking at this, the Windows 98 tier graphical presentation of everything, which probably is because this game is based on an old game that actually would run on a Windows 98, so there's a connection, but anyway, it's a shame, and it's the same thing with Total War, where it doesn't need to look so good, and it feels like you're missing something by playing the game, because the game is simulating some spectacle. There's some cool Dune-ass stuff happening down there in the dunes, but for the most part, if you're looking at it, you're probably playing the game wrong. Like, there's probably something else you could be doing other than watching the stuff fight each other. You actually can micro in this view and gain an advantage from doing it. I just tended not to. Really, when I come down here to look at things, it's myself, like, giving myself a break, I guess. It's a little treat. Like, yeah, let's watch these strike fighters do their strike. There's no advantage to doing so, but, you know, I can't be bothered to give another order, so we'll give the orders after the explosions, right? The explosions are over, let's actually make the attack. There was a case where the strike fighters randomly picking their own targets was a problem, because if all of those strike fighters had hit the production cruiser, it would be dead already. But because some of them fired at some of the smaller units nearby, I now have to make this attack to take it out, and during the attack, it's producing more units. So we really did suffer from not microing the strike fighters. I believe you can micromanage their targets, it's just really hard because they're small and fast and you probably won't select them in time to give them a new target, that sort of thing. Especially if you're not in the sensor view, which is really the only place you have any chance of doing it. One big downside actually to the sensor view is you can't see health bars on units of either side, so you kind of have to zoom in just to check, like, is my battle group about to die? Is the enemy about to die? How are things going? If we could see health bars out here in the zoomed out view, that would be just about everything we need. Now we've taken the 3 wreck positions and set up our scanners to look at them. Here comes another production cruiser over this dune, and I'm just absolutely bombarding it with strikes. The strike fighters are good against everything, they don't cost anything to use, and you have infinite ammo, so you can just keep striking the same location over and over if the enemy never destroy your fighters, which they won't do until later in the game. And this just makes them incredibly useful. I'd be happy enough to say they're overpowered even, because it felt to me like your combat performance in Homeworld Deserts of Kharak is very closely tied to how efficiently you use the fighters. Like, you want them to be in the air all the time and just sort of deploy them the second they're refueled. There's no notification for when new fighter strikes are available, so it's sort of instinct. You have to constantly check back with the KPC and check if things are fueled, or just constantly press the hotkey trying to send a fighter strike out until it works, like, all the time. This feels like the most efficient thing to do, because those strike fighters, they're just massive lumps of free damage, and that's going to protect your actual units and boost up your positive feedback loopy snowbally thing, where the more units are alive, the better they get, and the more damage you do and the less damage you take, therefore good things. Something, 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 strike everything, fight everything, strike fighters, forever. We'll see later cases where they're not so good. Here's me getting a bit owned, because the enemy have these railguns on high ground firing down into a group that has lost all of its light attack vehicles, the counter to railguns. So we're sitting here fighting against these normal enemy armoured vehicles. Our strike fighters are wasting their ammunition effectively by firing at those armoured vehicles, which we could otherwise just kill with our own armoured vehicles. While the railguns are just absolutely obliterating us at long range, we can't attack them from this position. We have to drive towards them quite slowly and get hit even more. We lose half of our armoured vehicles, and now I make this very messy escape where we start tanking shots onto our cruisers and our Rachel Sajette base runner story unit. I was distracted, as you can see, by the fact there's another battle going on around the KPC, and I was underestimating how well the KPC could defend itself in that situation. I did not need to be worried, essentially. but the distraction was enough to have me move all of my light attack vehicles away and be not paying attention until like a few seconds after the railguns had appeared and started killing all of my units. We do kind of escape during the engagement, and we do take out the railguns eventually. But losing half your army is never a good thing, and it's even less of a good thing in a positive feedback loopy, persistent army-ish game. I should also note, by the way, that your units level up and have various buffs and bonuses they get. I forget what they are, but it does tell you somewhere. Which means it's even more important to not have units die, because their total kills over the course of the campaign makes them individually more powerful. So even if you do have the resources to replace a lost army, you still really want to keep that army alive, which is true in real life as well. I'm complaining about this, sort of. I think this is a good setup. I like these mechanics. It just sounds like I'm complaining. Here's something I'll complain about. We're being attacked by a tornado over here. Looks like this railgun's on fire as a result. It's a very hot tornado. This is, as far as I recall, the only time this happens in the entire game. There's this one spot in this one mission where there are tornadoes that sort of follow you around and attack you and do damage. I don't know, it feels like they made a mechanic there and then just never used it again. There's a little thing there with a tornado. It's over now. So at some point, we've put together that this thing we found is a spaceship. It crashed here 1,000 years ago. And again, I'm still wondering, like, how much do we know about this? Is this a revelation? Are we like, oh, so that means there is a precursor civilization from 1,000 years ago? Did we know that already? I don't know how interesting this is, partially because of this thing I mentioned before, where your characters are very deadpan and professional sounding about everything. So when they're just like, yep, we just found this ancient spaceship from 1,000 years ago. Pretty cool, huh? I don't know if that is like a world-bending, mind-blowing revelation, or are we just like, oh, another one of those, right? Put that, get the form out for the 1,000-year-old ancient spaceship discovery. We'll just fill in the form there, and then we can go home and watch TV. I don't know, like, what the attitude of our people towards this is. Well, at some point we decide we're going to blow it up. And by the way, this is the next mission. This is one of those cases I mentioned where the missions are split up into multiple parts. So we completed that previous mission, which was to investigate the wrecks. And then there's another mission to investigate them even more. Why they're not part of the same mission, I'm not quite sure. I guess they wanted to be like, this game has over 10 missions. So some of the missions are split up into multiple missions technically, although this has no particular meaning. For this latest part of the mission, we need to blow up all of the wrecks we found earlier. Using the new feature, you can shoot demolition charges out of your salvages. Theoretically, I feel like you could use these in combat, only you'd need some micro and I wasn't paying attention, but the actual in-game purpose of them is to blow things up to collect artifacts. I claimed earlier that there was only one artifact you had to pick up. Well, that was a lie, because you have to pick up all of the ones on this mission as well. Essentially, the artifacts give you upgrades on the Kapisi, and I don't remember what they are, because when you pick them up, Rachel Sajet will take them to the Kapisi, and then for like a second it pops up somewhere on the screen saying what the upgrade actually did. It's things like certain units are produced faster, or certain units are better, or some of them increase the power capacity of the Kapisi, or the temperature capacity of the Kapisi. Well, literally, I don't know, and that's the point I wanted to make. There's some kind of upgrade system, and I wasn't completely on top of what it did, but I did try to get all of them whenever they came up, so probably something good happened because of that. You can see this time I'm not really guarding the Kapisi. I've started to cotton on to the fact it can probably handle itself, especially since I can send strike fighters to do extreme amounts of damage over and over again right in front of the Kapisi, and the closer to the Kapisi the damage is being done, the faster you can send them out again. Here is a little feature that's not going to come up very much in this video, but is a staple of Homeworld. We just captured an enemy unit. In the original Homeworld, you could send out your salvage units to just take enemy units off the battlefield and drag them home to make them yours. We have a slightly similar mechanic here, but it's downplayed heavily. Only Rachel Sajet can do it as far as I know, so you only have one unit that can capture. And you have to pay to do it. You pay your blue currency, which might be the Rue, can't quite remember, but we don't have any Rue right now, so I can't capture anything other than that one railgun I just got. Once you capture it, the AI brings it back to the Kapisi, and there has to be a clear route for it to make it there. Luckily in this case we were able to strike the enemies near the path of retreat, so we are going to get that extra railgun, but it's not for free. We essentially bought it off the enemy, and you can only do this now and again. So it's much less of a big deal than it was in the original Homeworld, where you could theoretically capture massive amounts of enemy ships to add to your fleet. And indeed, you should do that. It was very much to your advantage. And, well, taking that away, I guess takes something away from the Homeworld formula, but at the same time, I feel this sense of relief that I don't have to do it. Like, knowing that there's this sort of annoying, really gamey, really meta-y, optimal way to play, and that's been taken away, I think that's a good thing. I didn't really want to be worried about killing enemy units, because I'd be thinking, well, I should have captured it, I should have done this differently in some way. We're keeping things simple. We're just gonna kill them. And that makes life easy, I think. I'm happy enough to go without the capture mechanic being a central focus. As we saw there, the Capisi, once you upgrade it with certain power distribution thingies, will fire missiles in the same way that your strike craft do, making it a very strong strike craft, and strike craft already the strongest thing in the game. We're getting towards the point when we're going to do some Capisi first tactics, essentially. The Capisi is surprisingly good as a unit, and I think the game leads you away from using it, because it's like, be careful, we'll die if we lose this, but realistically, you just won't lose this. It's just a really strong unit. There's nothing that can kill it, especially in the early missions. You could just solo tons of the game with the Capisi. Now, after we've salvaged a bunch of stuff, a huge wave of enemy units comes to attack. All we had to do was retreat, which I was having trouble with because of control group issues. I'd accidentally got certain units into multiple control groups, and the game only says they're in one if they are actually in several, which causes various confusions, and it was happening right there. But during our retreat, we are saved by a cutscene, luckily enough, because another carrier shows up to fight with us. We're in some sort of coalition. I don't really know what our faction or what our nation is, but there are other elements of it that are sort of allied to us, and one of those groups has sent a carrier to help us. They're also going out to look for things, and they'll help us in this instance. We're not necessarily like very close allies. I'm not quite sure. We're kind of rivals or frenemies or something. Well, for now, they're going to help us fight off an enemy attack wave. Or are they? Because actually, all you have to do to end this mission is destroy these siege cruisers. The enemy brought some big things to fire at us, and you can form up next to the Sakala ready for a fight against them. But before the two sides met, you can see I was bombarding the enemy with long-range strike craft, and we completely destroyed the big things in question, even though they were actually defended by anti-air units that just weren't good enough because we sent so many air units against them. So now, as the two sides look like they're about to clash down in the basin, the mission ends, and that's the end of that, because the enemy's carrier, which was out there somewhere, decides to withdraw. So this is basically just saying, look, they've got a carrier as well, and we'll probably be fighting them somewhere later in the game. The main thing to point out, though, is look how cool it is. I was seeing things like this and just being like, damn, I wish Highfleet had been like this. I think I mentioned earlier that was the reason I started playing this game. Just looking for things that I wanted Highfleet to be like, and yes, this game totally is it. We move on to the next mission, which is a pretty simple one. We've entered an area that's got tons of wreckage, and we need to pick it up. It's resourcing time, as the game puts it. So, a mission to get some cash. The enemy is also out here getting the cash, so you need to do this quickly. Their salvages are picking up the resources. So we'll want to rush, effectively, and try to secure as much of the map as possible, and then go back and pick up the resources, just once they're ours for the taking. I'm now leading with the Capisi, as you can see. We're sort of trailing behind with most of our units. I think I had now come to the correct conclusion that rushing forwards with the Capisi is a pretty good idea, actually. One thing I wasn't sure about in this mission, and throughout the entire game actually, is how the enemy's production cruisers work, and this is a mission where the confusion is heightened. Because the enemy have salvagers on the field getting resources, you might think, well, that means the enemy do have a resource limit, and there's only so many units they can make and send against us from these production cruisers that when you see them just appear to be spawning units. I'm guessing they're buying them and spending resources so that you can outkill the enemy. Or can you? That's what I'm not quite sure about here. It might be the case that the enemy can infinitely create resources or infinitely get them, because on the vast majority of maps the enemy doesn't have any economy. They don't collect the resources. This is like a special case where they do, because you're racing against them. And I wonder, will the enemy ever run out of resources if you just let them keep making units and sacrificing them against you? because I was paranoid of the possibility of that being the case, I was aggressive enough that I didn't really get to experiment and find out if it is the case, because I always hunted down production cruisers the second I sniffed one being on the map. So that's what's happening right here. We've essentially quote-unquote rushed our way around the map, rushing very slowly because the Capisi is very slow, and now we get into this big messy fight, and here are cases where having the various types of units match up against each other correctly is going to be difficult because there's just stuff all over the place, and well, it's just too hard to click on them essentially. The icons are too small to really get good matchups, and the enemy's doing stuff as well. They're moving. You want me to click on something that's moving on the screen? Oh, that's too stressful. So we tend to just leave it to the AI to somehow sort out the fights, and it's going well. Primarily because I'm constantly strike fightering into the action, and again, having the Capisi right there means we're striking very regularly. Looks like tons of fighters are just circling the carrier though. I did notice they sometimes take a really long time to land, but if you order them to land, they'll do it straight away. There's something going on there that I wasn't really paying attention to. The point is, I got to the other side of the map and just really harassed the enemy's production cruisers, trying to take them all out, and mainly the way I did this was to constantly spam fighter attacks. Even when they had anti-air units, they will occasionally kill one of your fighters, but if you have enough fighters, you can do enough damage. It felt like it was a good trade to just try and spam as many fighters in as possible. In this case, the enemy production cruiser was defended by so little, we don't really need to be doing fighter strikes, but I just liked doing it. It was also quite fun. So we get to here. We've now killed all of the production cruisers. There's still tons of stuff on the map, but I felt like now it's a safe time to do our thing because the amount of enemy stuff won't be increasing. The goal now is to destroy the combat patrol it's talking about, which I actually almost destroyed in a previous engagement. There are now a couple of units out there that are the objective units to kill. But what I want to do is start getting some resources. This is a point where we have to start gaming the game. We have to be like, well, if I do the objective, it's gonna make me lose all these resources, so I have to deliberately not do the objective even though I could. And it just doesn't feel that good. Like, I don't like this design. This is the same rant from earlier basically, but again, it's rearing its head. We're gonna have to slowly pick up tons of resources and try not to kill too many enemy units in case it makes something bad happen. And that's going to slow things down dramatically as we gradually eat our way through the map. The game actually gives us the perfect opportunity to take all the resources because the objective went and sat in the corner of the map right on the edge of the passable area and just did nothing for a bit. So that roaming group is our goal, but they roamed their way out of the way of all of the resources. So now I could take the resources. Looks like I insist upon getting line of sight on them with that probe, so at some point I realised how to deploy probes, but you also saw me there deploying fighters against them. So I'm not quite going to fully exploit this. It was mainly because I didn't feel like I had to, but also because I don't want to, as implied by me complaining about this mechanical idea being in the game at all. It's kind of annoying to take all the resources and not do anything else. So while we take them, I might as well constantly bomb this group. The risk being that if we kill all of them, something bad might happen. And while I didn't know what it was going to be, it is going to turn out to be something that will disrupt our resourcing operations, although in a particularly fortuitous way. Essentially, I gave up on picking up the resources, but what I'd done is already take all the resources on the east side of the map, and that's where all the trouble comes at the next part of the stage. So by not going for the more natural choice of the west side of the map, I now don't have to advance to get any more resources once the enemy appear over there, which is going to happen in a second. And this also raises the thing I touched upon earlier, where once you know about scripted events that are going to happen in the campaign, you can prepare for them, and this was an ideal chance to do that. It's a set-piece finale to the mission where we have to assault this large enemy army towards the top right of the map. But because we were up there earlier, we could have put mines down. You can put mines down whenever you want, although I didn't do it very often. I think you do have to pay for them, but there are plenty of resources on this map to support covering the enemy's spawn point in mines, so we could have done something with that. Instead, well, our resourcing can continue because we're under no particular time pressure to make this attack, so we can still start clearing out the map. In the meantime, I made some probing attacks with fighters, although it does say the enemy are heavily defended by anti-air units this time. So just spamming fighters isn't the best idea, although most of their units can be persuaded to come away from the anti-air cover and be spammed by fighters, which is what is happening here. We're also doing some actual terrain strategy. This is the only time in the campaign where I remember doing something with the terrain. So I think it's an underutilized mechanic, or at least I underutilized it. But in this case, we have this little depression that you can't really see like back up on the sensor map, so you have to be looking at the real view to see what's going on here. It allows us to hide when the enemy's long-range railgun attacks start coming in, and of course to sort of ambush the enemy group, which we just did as it came over the lip of our little crater. Although we are interrupted in this action by a cutscene, because the enemy are sending a whole bunch of fighters. They're coming on a set path towards the Ashoka, the enemy carrier, and then they'll probably be spamming us after that if we let them through. So we need to pay attention to that and try to stop the fighters from landing. Meanwhile, I'm actually bothering to inspect the terrain there because there is another advantageous position one hill forwards, so we can creep towards the enemy while staying out of their line of sight, just meaning my group won't be surprised by any railgun attacks. So on the left of the screen, I'm setting up anti-air turrets with my base runners, vaguely in the position where the enemy's air force is coming in. On the right side of the screen, here comes an assault by enemy railguns. That would be trouble, but while we can't tell from up here, those railguns didn't have line of sight on me until they were right in front of me, and they died, so they weren't able to take advantage of their long-range attacks that could have picked us off. The only real point is that it's not very clear in the sensor view that my group was out of line of sight of the attacking group, so that was just an example of that. Having the topography be clearer and be more useful in terms of how it relates to game mechanics, or more usefully presented I should say, could be good, or again we could have the main view zoom out further, I don't know. There's still some kind of issue with there being these two views that are useful for different things, and I kind of think the zoomed in view is cooler, but the zoomed out view is more useful, and that feels annoying. It feels like I'm missing something as a player by being forced to use the better UI that's also less cool. Well anyway, looks like a very pointless engagement is taking place here because I tried to kind of secure the valley floor vaguely to the west of the enemy, and they just kept sending more and more things at me, and I was committed to this fight where we're blasting away at each other and it's really not to my advantage. I don't have the Capisi there. I'm distracted with my micro doing something else on the left, still preparing for the enemy's air attacks. I'm partially withdrawing the rail guns because I'm like, well, I'm just not going to use them. I want to keep them alive. And then later I start withdrawing the armored vehicles as well. Don't know why I didn't withdraw them all at once if I wasn't going to fight here. That was not a very good engagement. A very chess style engagement, to continue from my rants in the chess video recently. That's a fight where we just traded with each other, and we quote unquote won that fight in that we killed loads of enemies, but it's a loss strategically, like we should never have taken that fight. Now Sun Tzu kicks down the door and goes, why did you take a fight where you weren't guaranteed to win? If I was ultra cool, I'd give you the quote, but I don't remember what it is. It's something along the lines of, if you think you'll win, you have to fight no matter what. If you don't think you'll win, you have to not fight no matter what. It doesn't matter what you're ordered to do, you just don't fight if you're not going to win. And I'm pretty sure I violated that rule in that fight when I didn't know I would win that engagement. I was just kind of doing it. And while we won from a chess point of view, we lost from a real-life strategy point of view, in that the ability to engage in the future is more important than killing the enemy, assuming that you're better as a strategist than they are. So just not dying is an extremely good strategy. You don't die until the time when you have a 100% chance of winning. That way, there's a 100% chance that you will win. A very reliable strategic doctrine that's not very useful. It looks really bad, but essentially how it applies to this situation is, I should have just been hiding in the corner, taking all the resources, doing nothing, but I also didn't want to. Well, we come to a more decisive engagement here. When I finally bring everything forward, we've killed the enemy air force. Now I can deploy the Capisi on the front line and we take another trade-y engagement. But we have the advantage now because the enemy carrier is slightly too far away from the fight. Mine's in the fight, both attacking enemies and probably curing my own allies as well because it heals nearby armored units. The fight takes a long time because while we have tons of quote-unquote tanks, the armored units, the tanks in the game, only have machine guns as their weapon, so we don't really have a sort of anti-armor thing other than the railguns, and I've only got a couple of railguns because the ones I used to have died. Looks like they're actually not even really deployed in this fight, probably because I was not paying attention to how their line of sight was blocked by terrain. There they are on the left, actually at the back, just not taking part at all. So we still mess this fight up, but this time we take a much more favourable trade when we have a big enough advantage that maybe Sun Tzu would let me take that fight and take the win. Who knows? Sorry Sun Tzu for disappointing you. He's so mad at my Homeworld Deserts of Kharak gameplay, I can hear him from the afterlife screaming at me. Well, what's happening here? Some shenanigans, actually. We have this cutscene where the enemy deploys an EMP that disables our whole army. One thing about the cutscenes in this game is that they happen in real time, so if our units had been positioned differently, that EMP would have been less of a big deal. But because I was right up against the enemy carrier, they EMP'd our whole army and we got disabled for a while. Luckily, we've already killed most of the enemy. You can also see that something strange is happening. The enemy carrier is now trying to escape on a sort of scripted path, I presume. And that path allows it to drive right through the Capisi, so that doesn't look very good. Although it works well for us, because all they've done is drive behind us. I'm sacrificing tons of strike fighters to try and hit it with as many missiles as possible. The enemy had anti-air stuff in close proximity to my carrier, so I was getting blown apart as the fighters were taking off. But we get enough missiles to chase after the enemy as they drive off that we do take them out and avoid any further part to the stage, which it kind of looked like it was trying to set up. They tell us that yes, they've lost, but the war will never end because we're still trying to go to the stars. Well, I don't know, it just seems like a good idea to me. We've forgotten why we can't do it, and maybe they've forgotten why they can't do it as well. If they just explained like why there was a good reason for us not to do it, maybe we'd be convinced. We recover from the carrier some of their tech. The Galcian are more technologically advanced than us, and I'm not quite sure if we knew the reason for that, but we're kind of discovering the reason is because they control all this territory that has tons of crashed spaceships in it, they've probably been implementing space-age tech into their non-spaceships, so you might have noted that their vehicles float around and hover, whereas we're stuck driving like losers. So they've got the anti-gravity drives and such. I think in this case what we were doing is taking some coolant technology, because while this very rarely comes up, there is a mechanic where the Capisi can get too hot and you have to cool it down by disabling its systems. So getting extra coolant allows you to have more power put into weapons at the same time, or something like that. I didn't really have any trouble with that mechanic, and you can kind of imagine something where they would be like, well, the Capisi's overheating, so you have to park it in the shade or something for a while, and you can't use it for a bit because it's too powerful. It's more going the other way. By unlocking more cooling options, the Capisi becomes more powerful, because now you can just have more of its systems active at the same time. Therefore, let's keep sending it forwards as our frontline unit, basically. Now for the next mission, we've encountered a Galcian base, as it says on the screen, and they've probably got all sorts of goodies hidden away in this base because they've been salvaging spaceships, as we said, and now that we're aware that they probably have all of this secret tech, and this place is kind of on the way to our destination, we decide we might as well stop here and start stealing things. We have a nice messy fight as we approach the base. First you have to capture this excavation site which is on the way where we can get some resources. And we have one of these kinds of fights where, because both sides have the various shapes, you need to pay close attention to get this right, and I effectively don't. I've got my anti-railgun things attacking their anti-air units, which doesn't help, whereas the railguns are probably firing at me right now. Perhaps I was more thinking about just getting the strike fighters out, so I was killing the anti-air with high priority. Well, that's probably a good idea, since the strike fighters are so much more powerful than most other stuff in the game. Well, we do make it through that fight and get on to the real meat of the mission, which is going to be dealing with turrets. The enemy have turrets all over the place. It's sort of a gimmick mission to some extent. However, they also have these turret control towers, which are usually positioned in such a way that they're very easy to attack, and if you disable or destroy the turret control tower, the turrets are disabled as well. And when I say disable, I mean you can use an EMP on the turret control towers to temporarily turn off all of the turrets nearby. You can also try what I'm doing here, spamming missiles onto the control towers to disable nearby turrets. However, it turns out the turrets do fire anti-air missiles at your planes, and we even lose one there. So you can't completely exploit your way through this area, which is probably a good thing. So I might need to make a more cautious and normal looking attack on those control towers, and just try not to die too much. The issue is that the enemy will still attack this general area, the excavation zone, while you're away, which means you can't send everything in one direction because the enemy will come down the other direction and attack the Capisi. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think not being too cautious about bothering to defend the Capisi is probably the way to go, but I was being cautious, so I tried to maintain control of this central area with the resources as well. And because of that, I only wanted to move out with small groups, and I spent a lot of time building turrets in this area as well. However, eventually we can put together a strike group with Rachel Sajet in it to go and do the EMPing and destroy that control tower off on the right, while I'm dealing with another incursion coming down from the left at the same time. This is an annoying situation because I need to send forward the LAVs to take out their railguns, but that takes them into turret range of the other turret banks over in the west. Well, whatever. We've taken out one turret control center. That means all the turrets to the right are disabled permanently. And on the other side of that mountain is another control tower. If I kill that, I have a free run to the enemy base. But I'm trying to shoot over the top of the mountain. Your anti-air units have a secondary mortar attack that can shoot over impassable terrain. So that's what we're doing here. I've got this vague plan that I'll just hide out of line of sight, gradually kill the tower, and then move on. I'm not using the EMP, which would be an easier way to do this, then I could go in and attack it directly, which is probably a mistake, but just being there in general turns out to be a mistake because the next enemy attack comes around that corner and I'm forced to just flee because this strike group is too small to hold its own, with all of my units ready to defend against a strike from the other direction. Luckily, a few missiles from the fighters takes out most of the stuff pursuing us right away, so we're actually okay here really, and I'll move over the other units to deal with this. It turns out there is a rhythm where the enemy alternate which side they're going to send attack groups down. With that in mind, I decided to go for the other direction instead, mainly because the turret control towers were easier to hit. So it was going to be less hassle to advance, even though I couldn't do the cheeky shooting mortars over the cliffs thing like I wanted to. Doesn't matter that much. Instead, we just used the EMP, which you can tell because the enemy turret is blue and electric-y there. You know what a device that's turned off looks like, don't you? It has lightning shooting out of it. Yes, well, that should be enough. It's sort of one of those weird, like, universal things, like a disabled machine shoots lightning out of it in video games. I don't know why that is, but I guess it's pretty cool. So there you go. So we moved through that first area, and now the next turret control tower is just perfectly positioned to be attacked. So they've set this base up very generously to be as vulnerable to attack as possible. That was nice of them, I guess. They could have done something special where you had to sort of run through the turrets to attack something behind them while they were disabled and do some tanking and healing or something like that. It feels like if this wasn't so much of a gimmick mission, like if this ever happened again, they could do a more advanced version of it, but I don't think it does ever happen again. You might notice me here using Bandbox attack, and I wanted to give a shout out to that mechanic, a little workhorse of the game that makes it a lot better in my opinion. It was the same deal with the original Homeworld as well. You can hold control to Bandbox attack orders onto a group, so you are essentially giving the order for one of your groups to attack one of the enemy's groups in a set area. And then the AI works out the details, which is just really fun. Like, it allows you to make rear attacks and stuff with just like simple 1 or 2 order combos, and it's really good. It's essentially the kind of functionality that in other RTSs would be done by attack move, but it's more clever and involves the player a bit more, and I just really enjoyed that. So it's an upgrade on attack move, bandbox selection, like attack area commands. I think that's the way to go actually, because it lets you have your different unit types attack different areas simultaneously easily. Like, you could do that in other RTSs, it was just more annoying to set up. Here it's so seamless and quick. It always felt really natural and gave me this feeling of being very much in control of what's going on. I really enjoyed just the game feel of controlling the units in this RTS versus other ones. There was a really short sequence where you had to capture and defend the enemy base, but they only attack for like a minute, and then you get this countdown where the base is about to explode. Rachel Sajet is on the inside somewhere, but it tells everyone else to just get out of there. So your goal is to get out of the detonation zone, but 2 enemy attack groups come in from both sides. You probably could slip away, but I think realistically you're supposed to kill one of them so that Rachel can also escape. We're going to go west because it was closer, and here we'll see another example of the enemy having this big army, but by just spamming in tons of fighters as it comes in, we like destroy most of it really easily. So as the 2 sides actually come into clashing range, the enemy are virtually dead already. Just the power of being really quick on the hotkeys for sending out fighters as soon as possible and getting the damage in. They're really good. Eventually Rachel pops out of the building as well with 30 seconds to go. The group coming from the east has just arrived, but we can drive away fast enough that it's not too much of a problem, and we can even shoot backwards and EMP to stop the enemy pursuing us, and indeed force them to be stuck in the blast radius of their own base's self-destruct sequence. So they really didn't want us capturing this area. At least they don't get it either, and Rachel did pilfer some things I think when she was in there. And now we have a nice sequence of Rachel driving away, and the only thing I wanted to note here is you can see the cockpit, the windscreen on this giant car is that tiny thing in the corner. You kind of look at it and think, oh, it's the size of a monster truck. No, it's like 10 times the size of a monster truck, this thing. Everything's bigger than it looks, and you can't really tell because you never see any small things for scale in the game. Well, we didn't get to completely loot the base in the end, but Rachel had a good look around. I think that's what comes of this. And she learned a bit more about the Galcian situation, which is explained to us in the post-mission cutscene. There's kind of this little audio scene after each mission where somebody says something. And here, this guy says his name. While he's not a named character, in at least this scene, he does say what his name is. It's Nathan. Very boring names for this sci-fi setting, but whatever. So I don't know why they didn't actually call him Nathan, like, in the subtitles there. Who knows? He mentions the thing I think I mentioned earlier, where the enemy's religion is something about us being sinful and being banished to this planet, which is actually what happened in the deep lore, but the game never actually goes further than this little mention towards it. I only know this because people told it to me in the comments of a different YouTube video about Homeworld, at that sort of level. Like, the game really doesn't use its lore to do anything, it's just hinting at it there. And, well, this follows on in the next scene here, where it shows us a cutscene from the enemy's perspective of their people receiving a speech from their guy. And it's one of these tiny glimpses into the actual world this game takes place in. And it just has so much promise. Like, I wanted them to explore this sort of thing much more. Like, what even are these societies we're fighting for? Like, I have no idea what my faction is. It's occasionally called the Coalition. Who are we? And stuff like that. Like, there's no point even telling you what questions I have, because I have all of them. And, well, I know a little bit about the enemy. They do this sometimes. They have a guy sitting in a neat hammock and wearing some sort of aviation mask who shouts at his people about how they're going to take over the world and such. Well, that's something. What do we do? I prefer this faction. Can we join the enemy? They look pretty cool out there. I don't know. Well, this is just like shown to you, and then we go back to our little journey. And it feels like the same vibe I got from the original Homeworld is coming through loud and clear here. The world has tons of depth, but it has no impact on the game. It's really just something it shows you as a distraction from the game, and then we get back to some really normal RTS action with minimal plot relevance, I suppose. Like, most of the missions are just us going to the plot relevant location, and all of this is just the 5 seconds at the start of Homeworld when it said, "We once went on an expedition and found a thing." So, like, it doesn't really have any plot relevance. There is a better plot, of which this is part, and it feels like they're wasting that to some extent. That said, as I mentioned earlier, I also really like the way they present this story for what it is, and the vibe of the characters, and the sort of weird wrong feelingness of it. Like, the way nobody cares, I really like that. It's the sort of thing people would probably criticize, but I find it to be a nice aesthetic. I enjoyed it for whatever reason. Well, anyway, it's time to drive even further into the desert. We're like halfway to the destination, so we'll just keep driving. Again, there's more wrecks all over the place and more triangles to pick up, so those will be useful. Let's keep going. This map gives you the chance to get some resources, really. That's what it's all about. I remember this from the original Homeworld as well. Sometimes there was a mission where it's just like, well, this is here because you might have no resources at this stage in the game, so like you might need a chance just to build your army back up from a disastrous previous mission, something like that. So really, we're just going around harvesting resources. The enemy are also here though, and indeed they are also harvesting the resources. So like earlier, it's a resource harvesting race, where ideally you want to not really stop to harvest things at first, just rush around and secure various places where you could harvest, and then go back and get everything later. In this case, the enemy are also harvesting the artifacts you can break out of wrecks. Those are the things that upgrade the Capisi, and also the things where I don't remember what they actually do. I think it tells you at the time you pick them up what each one individually does, but I don't remember what any of them were. So clearly it made an impact on me. There's something going on with this. Here, we can see the enemy escaping with an artifact. The good news is that whatever this artifact is, it is not destroyed by just completely bombing the unit carrying it, so that's handy. You can imagine them doing something where you have to use Rachel Sajet to capture a unit that is carrying an artifact rather than blowing it up, or you don't get the artifact. They were more generous than that. So we're going to get some upgrades, there's tons of triangles there for us to pick up, but we can't wait around here to pick them up, we have to rush on to the next site. Essentially, we're looking for a particular artifact. That's the story thing that's going on. And it's at this one. To cut a long story short, it's by this wreck. Again, the enemy actually captured the thing before we arrived, probably because I'm insisting on sending the Capisi first, so we're moving quite slowly as a result. We could rush forward the army and capture these locations before the enemy mined them. Well, again, we arrive essentially just in time and stop the enemy escaping with the thing. And that's the story thing, a power source that will power up the Capisi and allow you to put more power into weapons, things like that. Now after that, the mission is just to finish off the enemy on the map, and this is the point where what you should do is go back the way you came and harvest everything. But as you can see, I didn't. Well, maybe I cut out the fact that I did. I actually didn't. This is like 2 minutes after the last shot. There you go. So I am just playing badly. Why? Because I don't want to play well. It's just this again. So we have this clash with an enemy carrier where I probably could have left them in the corner and gone back and done my own thing for as long as I wanted. Instead, I rushed them down, and we have another weird carrier clash where they just drive right through us. Really feels like the carriers shouldn't be passable to each other. That's just really weird. Maybe the AI programming or the pathfinding just couldn't cope with the inability to get around carriers, and you could sort of exploit the AI by blocking them off from certain areas with your carrier. Something like that. Feels like there should be collision. There isn't, and that guy just sort of drives through us, getting shot the whole time, and very soon blows up. So we had a relatively easy finish to the mission, but the big point is, we didn't harvest all the resources, and it really felt like the game was giving us a chance there to harvest them. Not that I particularly needed them, but I still felt bad for not doing it. We'll come back to that. The cutscene after explains that all of these wrecks in particular are surprisingly unwrecked and seem to have been just sort of placed in the ground quite neatly by somebody. And it's because, not quite sure how we worked this out, but it's because they were teleported here from space. I don't know, maybe there was some teleport dust on them still. So this is a hint at this thing where our planet is actually some sort of prison, and people who come near it are teleported underground or into the ground in their ships and are stuck there. So we're starting to piece together that you're not allowed to come here normally, and if you come near this place, you disappear. So maybe that was what it's supposed to be. It's like a prison where it throws ships near it and they get teleported down to the surface and disabled, and then you just have to live on the planet. I think that is what it is, but then again, I don't know. And of course the big point is, if I didn't have all this outside information, I wouldn't make anything of what the game's telling me. Like, it's giving me so little information about the lore. I can't put any pieces together because I have no pieces. Like, I'm using my own pieces from my own puzzle that I brought from home, and that feels like a mistake. We're moving on to the next mission, where the Sakala, the other coalition carrier that is sometimes on the mission with us, is fighting two enemy carriers on the other side of that chasm, and we're supposed to help them. Now you can, from the very starting area, send units down into the chasm and presumably go up to take part in the battle. However, if you want to send the Capisi to the battle, you have to drive all the way to the top of the map and then down again first because of the routes not being very wide. And that's what I wanted to do. So long story short, I didn't really send any units to help the Sakala. What I did do though is use my air support to help them out, and really that's going to be enough. Like, if I was going to fight for them, the air support would probably be doing most of the damage anyway, so you don't really need to go over there, I don't think. We can take it slow, just really gradually trailing behind the Capisi as I drive towards the top of the map, sometimes stopping to pick up a few triangles along the way. And the good news is that this works even better than I thought, because after a while, by the time I've driven to the top left of the map, the Sakala stops coming under attack and it will just repair itself in the corner. Looks like I was distracted trying to shoot missiles down off this cliff against that enemy attack group which has to go around the cliff. Some shenanigans. But yes, the objective gets completed without us going over there. So that's handy. Now you have to take out the two carriers that the Sakala was fighting. And again, this is a chance to not go after the carriers and just sort of stay up here in the corner taking all of these resources. But again, for whatever reason, I didn't really feel compelled to do that. So while I did leave some salvagers behind to pick up some stuff, we're going forwards anyway, just because we can. This is an extra bad time to go forwards actually, because not only do we not have Rachel Sajet in the army, who is a nice healer because I've got her looking for artifacts back near the start of the mission, we don't have the Sakala. In theory, you could aid the Sakala's advance, I think, and bring its units up to help you in the final battle with the enemy two carriers. Instead, I just started going all out on this first of the 2 carriers. We've unlocked cruise missiles now, so you can chip away at it from a distance. I also sent in loads of fighters, because it looked like it wasn't defended by anti-air. But then there were loads of anti-air units literally right behind it that come out of the fog of war as my fighters were flying in. So that's less than ideal, although you can order the fighters to land. The only problem is, it takes a long time for fighters to land, and they circle around being vulnerable to attack for a while before landing. However, because the enemy also rush forward with like 10 anti-air units for some reason, basically unsupported, well, actually the reason is probably that they were chasing my planes back to my carrier, well, we've brought them out here. And what I thought was, my armoured assault vehicles would quickly kill them off, and because of that, I started ordering more attacks towards the enemy carrier in the air, thinking like, oh, in 2 seconds, the enemy's anti-air defences will be down because they're under fire from my tanks right now. But no, I was taken off guard slightly by the fact the armoured assault vehicles take a really long time to kill anything. Their offensive power is pretty low. Again, it's probably the railguns that we need for this situation, and I'm still not really deploying them for one reason or another. So I end up getting my planes shot. That's the long and short of that strategic situation, but it's still generally fine. The fight goes on and I start ignoring it because I really wanted to get this artifact down in the corner with Rachel Sajet, so we're setting up the explosives to do that. Cut back to the fight. Looks like we won, so that's something. Our army's in terrible condition, but we can just sort of park up next to the Capisi for a bit and try to heal. Looks like we're also being attacked from the south at the same time. Helping us out amid the chaos is the fact we have now unlocked artillery cruisers. That's the things I've got set to group 7 over there. Those are essentially big things that shoot really far. Again, because we're using the sensor view so much, we don't get a good idea of what the artillery cruisers even are. Like, how long was it in the game until I even looked at them? I was using them for a long time before I knew what they were. Well, the artillery cruiser is actually one of my favourite units in the game, both in terms of its gameplay function and how it looks. Maybe we'll see more of it later on. My salvaging plan was ruined because the enemy actually starts taking the plateau we started on. So I need to really send the whole army back to the beginning and do the salvaging, like bit by bit, just keep all of our stuff together. However, because I'm parked next to the objective, and it would be annoying to drive back to the salvage area, salvage it, and then drive back to the objective, I kind of didn't want to. Again, it's just laziness, and a sort of resentment at the idea that I should have to go back and harvest resources. It would be a good idea, because right now we actually don't really have any resources, because I took heavy losses in that first fight, which again we didn't even need to take. So we're really just doing this mission with like every wrong move possible, and the Sakala still isn't in position to help us. The reason was there were these couple of railguns here that were killing the Sakala's army for the entire mission, just over and over again, and the Sakala AI couldn't deal with this. Eventually we kill them, and this gives the enemy the leeway to move up towards the objective. However, I've also kind of started fighting the objective myself, so we're not gonna wait for this. Again, I'm doing this badly, not necessarily like deliberately or to stir up trouble, just because I didn't really want to play it well, because the playing it well option seemed a bit more boring and maybe I felt like I didn't need to, something like that. There's some sort of comment to be made here that I don't like that I'm having to sit here and be like, well, this is a bad strategy, because at the time I thought it would be fun. It feels like the more effective strategies are less interesting to pull off in the game, so I'm just sort of doing this in a chaotic fashion. And again, the enemy carrier comes in for a melee attack. I don't know what it is with the carrier AI. They love to drive into you for some reason, and well, it doesn't work very well, although in this case they might have caused my artillery to fire at my own units, so maybe there was something there. At the end, after we kill the carrier, you can see me ordering my guys back towards the salvage area, thinking maybe there's a bit of hope for me to actually go back and pick up some resources. But no, unfortunately, the mission ends there. And again, we left absolutely massive amounts of resources just on the field. What I want right now is for the game to just give me them, and just be like, let's pretend you picked them up. Because I could have picked them up, it's just that the other gameplay activities were more interesting. It's kind of like, it feels like I'm being punished for playing too well, almost, like well, quote unquote. Like, to play well in the game, ideally means to do the objective and get all the resources. But I also feel that playing well should be things like completing the objective as quickly as possible, or like taking out the carriers without any help from the allied carrier. Like, that feels like an achievement. Like, give me an achievement game for doing it in a cheeky, aggressive, and harder than it needs to be fashion, I was enjoying myself playing it in this fast and loose way. But it's also annoying that I am being punished for playing like this, because it feels like the way I'm supposed to play is worse. So I'm being punished for playing too well. That's the weird argument I'm making. Again, I am the best gamer of all time, and everything that's gone wrong is somebody else's fault. So we come away without a full army after that mission, and without any resources either. Not ideal, and because I was very aware of this, as we go into the next mission, I'm going to be playing things much more carefully, and actually start trying to get all the resources on the map, and do all of the stuff that I'm saying is a good idea, but I didn't want to do. And, well, we'll complain about it in a second, obviously, because that's why I'm here. For this mission, we have to secure this large plateau because it looks kind of like a runway, and we can use it to land some more supplies from back home. What is back home? Again, we don't really know. It also mentions there that a previous expedition under Rachel's brother had found out about there being a big orbital satellite that's defending the area we're trying to go to. So generally you can't go to the so-called primary anomaly where the ship from Homeworld is located because a laser kills you. We'll be able to use that to our advantage later, so good to know about. There's our big runway, and you can see various triangles around it as well. Let's do something with this. And this is an ideal mission for having the artillery cruisers, by the way, because you can already tell it's like loads of little passages. So having indirect fire weapons that shoot over the tops of hills is going to be very handy. There's the artillery cruiser towards the bottom right. I thought I'd add here that, well, it looks like a box with a gun on top, and I mentioned earlier it's my favourite sort of looking unit in the game. The reason for this is not because it's particularly interesting, it's because it has a very practical looking design. Like, we'll probably never see it again because I'm stuck in the sense of view the whole game. It's a box with a small gun array on top. And I liked the idea that if you were like designing a unit, you would probably be like, oh, it's the artillery cruiser. It should be like a massive gun coming out of a thing, like the weapon should be the main thing you see when you look at it. But the artillery cruisers in this game are more vehicles. They're really practical looking in that they have a couple of weapons, but they have a realistic consideration in that most of the stuff that this ship is just its own life support. It's its own ability to move and crew compartments and ammunition and stuff. So the actual guns are really small compared to the size of the ship. It's just like a little thing, like a real-life battleship. Like, a real-life battleship isn't a huge gun floating on a hull. It's a hull full of things that occasionally has guns on it. And I liked that about the artillery cruiser. I'm effectively making a similar argument to this idea that I like the way the dialogue is presented in a very emotionless and boring sounding way. I like the quote-unquote boring design of the artillery cruisers because it's so sensible. It kind of vibes like if you were making a desert vehicle. So much of the equipment in the vehicle would just be about being able to drive in the desert at all, and then you have this little compartment at the back where it's like, okay, I guess we'll put a gun on it as well because it's supposed to be a military vehicle. That just makes sense to me. I liked that idea. It fits with the vague aesthetic of the game to have really under-designed units that barely look like they're supposed to be in combat at all, because realistically, while the player only sees them being used as combat units, they're actually places where people live in the long term, and they need to have everything associated with that on board. I liked that. Once again, talking about something I'm not showing on the screen, and that is another point to make unto itself. I wish I was showing what I was talking about on the screen, because that would be cool, wouldn't it? Both in terms of a gameplay experience and in terms of making my commentary make marginally more sense. But no, the entire thing I'm talking about here in terms of unit design is the things, the little rhombuses down there with 7 next to them. Those rhombuses with 7 next to them are the best designed unit in the game. I love that rhombus more than you can possibly imagine. Those hacks in Hollywood probably would have made it a trapezoid or something, but no, it should have been a rhombus, and it is. A rhombus is a realistic shape for an artillery cruiser. I've lost the plot. I think the game's good graphics should have been used more in the game. They matter a surprisingly small amount, and really, you're giving yourself a little treat by coming down to actually look at the graphics, because you don't need to. I'm just like, sometimes I go down to watch an enemy unit die or something, especially to watch the strike fighters deliver their payload, because that's always fun. But you quote-unquote shouldn't, and you don't need to. Feels like this sort of at odds thing between how cool strategy games can look and how they don't need to look good at all is rearing its head here in Homeworld Deserts of Kharak. You might also be able to tell the careful way I'm playing here. Just sort of creeping forwards with the Capisi and constantly using its power shifting to increase its range, to fire long-range missiles at the enemy buildings and take them out. And, well, we can do the same thing with groups of enemy units, with the artillery especially, because you can just saturate fire things from outside of the enemy's vision range. Stuff like that. We want to avoid risks as much as possible. Even like right here, I give this order to advance, and then immediately give it to retreat again, because I'm like, no, I'm not going to advance with the army separate to the Capisi. We're going to play this as carefully as possible. Let's just everyone stick together in the corner. We'll go and sit on some triangles for a bit and just make sure we get them before we do much else. Another thing to mention, by the way, is earlier in this commentary, I was like, I can't believe that turrets are a gimmick and they never used them again. They actually did use them again in this mission, and I just completely forgot. So, well, this is a comment either on the game or on me. Either I don't even remember what I'm talking about, which is very likely, or maybe the turrets had so little impact on the game I didn't remember them coming up again after the first time they came up, when they had more impact. I guess because at this stage, we have units that outrange the turrets, so you can just blow up the turret control centers and you never have to fight them, so they're basically fine. And yes, you saw me there using some artillery and air attacks to just kill the enemy from the other side of this mountain thing with impunity. So this is a great mission to start playing carefully, because we finally have an arsenal that allows us to just creep along the map, never really engaging the enemy properly and building up our resources. Which is probably what we should have been doing for the last couple of missions. Now I kind of have to do it because we're finally out of cash. Inconvenient. There's only one problem with my grand plan to creep across the map. I don't really want to carry it out, and you can see that very soon I've split the army up again. Not in a very useful sort of way. I don't know, we're just doing several things at once, or not doing several things at once. We could be keeping this group together. One thing that pushed me though to split the army up more was we've now got these battle cruisers, which act as very strong frontline units, which right now I'm using to tank turret fire as I don't advance on the turrets. Not a very good use of this tanking opportunity. Well, I don't know, I'm just playing this really badly, that's what I'm saying. For no good reason. The only reason I sort of think was behind all of this was that I wanted to feel like I was microing on several fronts and doing something. Well, actually, I was microing extremely badly on several fronts and achieving nothing on all of them, so probably not worth even trying at that stage. The enemy are all over the place right now, so this would be a great time to be like hunkered behind a wall just firing artillery into these big groups of enemies. Instead, I'm going to fall back and hide in corners, use my support cruisers to try to repair all the damage I just took doing absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, the Capisi is trying to very slowly advance up towards the runway. After a while, I finally stopped trying to attack on two fronts and just thought, we'll move the Capisi and all of the big units together in a blob. But I'm keeping some of the smaller units and the salvagers out there in the secured territory to do some salvaging. I could wait by the salvage with the main force to be extra safe and make sure that these units aren't under threat. But that would probably be too much for my impatience. I'm very impatient because I don't have that long each time to play the game. So if a mission takes an hour, then that's the only mission I'll be able to do that day, that sort of thing. And it feels better to make a bit more progress than that, so often I'm just trying to do stuff. I don't know, I guess I'm just playing a game, I don't want to wait to pick up the resources. It's just that comment again. Not that you actually have to play like that, it's just that the game encourages you to play that way with its persistence. And the way that you don't get the resources after the mission. Basically, if it just gave you the resources after the mission, all of this complaining I'm doing would be gone. And I'm pretty sure the original Homeworld did do that as well, so there's a strong precedent for doing that. Something. We are now advancing on the enemy with this relatively undefeatable group of the Capisi and a bunch of heavy cruisers. We have the assault cruiser as well as the battle cruiser, another new unit. It's a similar sort of thing, a gigantic thing with guns on it. But I think it's worse. It's using enemy technology, so it's the ones that are floating around, you might notice down here, in this special treat of me actually watching the enemy get killed, because I don't need to give any orders. I guess that's one of the good things about this group, because they have long range and they're powerful. You don't need to micro them in combat, so you can watch the combat and you get to see it. That's nice, isn't it? Looks like half my army is just doing absolutely nothing. I guess we don't need them at this stage. Maybe I was trying to guard my salvages or something. Well, a while later, 40 minutes later as it says in the top left, after a long time just wandering around, I finally go to the objective, which we could have done right at the beginning, and start securing this runway. That's easy enough, just a few units on it to kill, and with our gigantic force now set up, with plenty of resources and with a pop-capped army good to go, we are pretty strong. Looks like I did this wild charge with Rachel Saject towards the final group defending the runway. I was trying to capture something by the looks of things, but capturing units that are under heavy fire and artillery bombardment is a bad idea. It's even worse than in the original Homeworld because you lose resources trying to do it. So we take some damage on our story unit, but we can repair her up. Then I thought the mission would end right there, but actually you have to defend the runway against another force that comes down from the other end. And I was trying to use this time to do that thing you can see on the left, go and secure that little valley next to the runway with a few more triangles in it. But we're not really going to have time because the enemy are driving towards us too fast. So all I've really done is split my army up, and I don't have as much as I could have available for this decisive final battle. A bad move once again. But once again, I'm sort of blaming the game for forcing me to make this bad move. I didn't want to make that move, essentially. The good news is that it doesn't matter whatsoever, because this force I have right here is so strong, the enemy won't get anywhere near us. And look at that, for a few seconds, we actually did see that artillery cruiser that I liked the design of so much for just like one frame on the screen. An incredible treat here on the Offie Game Grounds channel, or whatever this channel's goddamn called. Well, the good news is that the enemy force up there just gets obliterated by the artillery. It looks like they stopped advancing. Maybe they were scripted to go to a certain point on the runway, and then they just didn't have line of sight on us, so we just kept killing them. The reason I have so much line of sight is I have the Capisi's power distribution thing, all going into range and sensors, so we have a lot of line of sight and a lot of long range attacks available to us. With the runway secured, we see on the way in an absolutely gigantic cargo plane type thing. Continuing my theme that I started this video with, of things I thought would have been cool if Highfleet had done them, and here we are once again finding those cool things in a different game, exactly where I suspected they would be found after all. That's good. Once again, whoever made Highfleet, please play this game and then make Highfleet 2 and combine it in some way, please. Well anyway, the point is, the mission continues with a defend the runway area, or actually I think this might be the next mission in the game. It's another one of those things where it kind of splits up, but the map is persistent between the missions for whatever reason. So at least this part's going to be quick, right? You only have to defend for 10 minutes, so it's not going to take 40 minutes to do this part. As for what I didn't give myself any treats in this segment. I essentially stayed in the sensor view and just moved my group around, because I now know this group is really powerful, it's got healing units among it, it's really long range. All I need to do is attack move the cruiser assault force towards the enemy's incoming forces, and they will probably chew through them over time. Meanwhile, the Capisi is doing a good job of stopping the enemy getting up to the runway by just tanking the enemy's main thrust of their attack right there. Probably not the best thing, you might have noted if you're looking super closely. I did give the Capisi one power point into armor, so it will take slightly less damage because of that. That's nice of me. But it wasn't even needed. Really, we never came close to losing the Capisi, even using it as our frontline unit, so that's good. Now I want to shut up and allow you to listen to the audio aesthetic of the game, and in particular the constant chatter you get in the background and people talking to you while you're playing.
Listen up. Alert, strike fighter destroyed. Artillery cruiser under attack. Units respond. Alert, command. Carrier hull at 75% integrity. Op ready. Green line confirmed. Hostile range craft destroyed.
Strike fighter ready for service.
Armor vehicle taking effective fire.
Strike fighter approach vector dialed in.
Alert, hostile bomber sighted. Report. Enemy light attack vehicle marked on approach. Enemy contact on the board. The turret is under fire. Send message.
I really like, again, this crossover of the kind of epicness of our quest and the intense combat, mixing with the relatively relaxed music and the very matter-of-fact and clinical way in which everybody is talking about what's happening, and indeed the fact that people are talking to you about what's happening constantly, and that information is useful because like whenever any of your units sees the enemy, it tells you about them and what type of unit it is and just things like that. It's very natural. It's like, yes, this is probably the sorts of things that a commander might actually hear about while playing, whereas normally in an RTS, I would just be like, oh, I didn't notice that thing happening, I wish somebody had told me, that sort of thing. Which I very much enjoyed. I just like the way everything somehow mixes together into a very otherworldly RTS experience that somehow still makes complete sense, and stands apart from other RTSs because of it, I think. Now what's happening here, the Cicala has shown up once again. One of these planes was for them, and we do successfully get a landing of the gigantic thing. This was so cool, and again I was just like, damn, this is exactly what I was imagining Highfleet should have been like when I was playing it. If you haven't actually played Highfleet or seen my video on it, Don't worry about that, it doesn't matter all this stuff I'm talking about. Basically, privately, I was just here to look at cool desert warfare on a gigantic scale stuff. And this game delivered in that department, where a different game that I thought might didn't. And that's really the sum of all that. So now we have to defend the runway a bit more, while also going out to take out some anti-air squads to help some other planes land. This is easy enough because my cruiser group can go out and blow everything out of the quote-unquote water. The sand is blue in the sense of view, so it kind of makes you think like you're playing a naval combat game, especially because everything in the game is referred to as ships. Well, it's not. It's sand, as it turns out, but still pretty cool. We blow them out of the sand, and the enemy sink easily. However, while we're waiting for the next couple of planes to come in, the Sakala the captain of the Sakala is giving us this rant about how actually we can't be the ones to ascend, their religion's a bit different to ours. Again, while we're allied to them, I don't really know any of the details about that. Like, I'm only saying I'm allied to them because the game said that at some point. We're not that allied to them, as it turns out, and they start shooting down our transport planes. So that's not very nice of them, is it? Not very cash money at all. I believe they don't want us to find the thing because they want to find the thing. And it might be some sort of internal factional rivalry, like we are the Sajet clan of the coalition, they're the something else clan of the coalition, so there's a reason. Again, I wish I wasn't speculating, that's all I want to say about this point. I wish I knew a bit more about what was going on, because this didn't have much impact as a result. Like, they are hamstringing the story to some extent by not giving you any information on what's going on. Because in pure gameplay terms, I didn't really feel particularly allied to the Sakala because I was annoyed at them from that previous mission where they didn't help me very much and it was me having to help them. Like, they're a liability to me. If they want to be the enemy, fine. Do you guys think I won't park 4 artillery cruisers out of your line of sight and just kill you? I'm doing that to everyone these days. Like, if you want to add yourself to the pile, fine. We've already taken out like 5 enemy battle carriers. Adding another one in, it's just like, well, fine, you can just go in the list at some point, we'll kill you later. Well, anyway, now we're racing with them to get to the thing. I think in particular, Rachel has gone ahead to look for the thing, but the Sakala is now chasing Rachel, and we need to save Rachel because she's the only person that really knows what's going on and such. Maybe we're also, to some extent, supposed to want to save her because the characters back on the Kabisi like Rachel, and that's another thing to sort of bring up along the lines of this whole everybody's emotionless plot line, because while I like it, I guess it does cause some suffering in the story, in that like, these people don't even know each other's names, for the most part. I don't even know, like, do we care about saving Rachel? She's probably very replaceable as far as I know. All she does is drive the car around. We can get somebody else to do that. We get people killed doing that all the time. I don't know, maybe there should be more rapport or something between, like, the 3 main characters, like the captain, the intel officer, and the science officer, which is Rachel. And then it would feel like more of a thing for her to be out on her own and be under threat from the betrayal of the Sakala, and the betrayal of the Sakala would probably also be more of a thing. It's the guy who likes writing things, complaining about the writing. But again, I wouldn't trade a normal-ass story for the aesthetic of this game. I prefer it to be like this than to be like as I was just describing, but not have this aesthetic. And maybe it being really emotionless is so core to the story, or the aesthetic, that you couldn't change that. We are back at it again with the absolute classic off-ED comment, which goes something like, I absolutely detest everything about this game. However, nothing can be changed. It's perfect the way it is. And then we just throw that towards the developer and be like, there you go, that's what I thought of your work. I complained about every single aspect of it, like microsecond to microsecond I had problems with it. Do not change a thing. Ideal, it would be ruined if you changed anything. It's really just food for thought, I guess, because yes, at the end of the day I'm saying, well, I think I like the game the way it is actually, but I'm, again, fantasizing about a slightly different game. What if Homeworld Deserts of Kharak was an epic adventure through the desert with gripping character drama, but it was also a really clinical, kind of boring feeling, but then somehow relaxing and appealing and really authentic feeling military expedition experience at the same time. It's possible those two things that I'm asking for are mutually exclusive, but it's also possible that they're not. Anything's possible in development and anything's possible in story writing. Somebody make Deserts of Kharak 2 Devin Boogaloo with all singing, all dancing, all military engineering jargoning, let's just keep going with the commentary. It looks like Rachel fended off the Sakala's vanguard forces, mainly thanks to using an EMP that just disabled all of them, so we shot them to pieces, and we can quickly put down a couple of turrets here as well beside this wreck we're defending. I can't quite remember what this wreck is. It's significant. We needed to do something here before we go to the main thing and do the other thing. Yes, I'm paying full attention to the story that I am also critiquing, meaning my critiques are extremely valuable. This sequence is one of those change-up sequences that you normally expect in RTS games, and I think Deserts of Kharak doesn't use this enough. The thing where you don't have your base anymore and you control only a few units to do a certain thing. That thing that most RTSs have in their campaigns. Homeworld Deserts of Kharak doesn't really do that very much, and it probably could. It is quite a short game as well, and you could probably pad it out by having some missions where like you're just playing as Rachel doing something out on your own, and potentially giving you the opportunity to have a more sort of quiet, down-to-earth experience where you get more of the story at the same time. More of that macro versus micro strategy thing where you switch between economy stuff and micro tactic stuff in different missions. I think they could have done a decent amount more of that. This was just an example of a tiny amount of that kind of gameplay switch up, but it was for literally a few minutes, and then the Sakala shows up and you run away. You can sacrifice the units it gave you at the start to help yourself run away. We have this very ineffectual fight against the enemy's light vehicles, which can dodge all of our shots. All you had to do is drive Rachel to the edge of the map, and then your full army spawns in, and you can get down to business. So it would be nice, I think, if there was more, like, between the start of this mission and the end of the last mission, where maybe there was more of an adventure when Rachel was detached from the main fleet that you could go on, and that should also happen early in the game as well. More missions. I mean, this is a good thing. I'm saying I want there to be more missions in the game, so clearly I like the game, so interpret again my complaints as compliments as usual. So what's happening here? I've advanced so quickly with just the Capisi and the lighter units that I'm actually suffering in combat here. We have this not very good fight because all of the good units are trailing way behind. For whatever reason, I really rushed down this resourcing site. I didn't really need the resources, I just wanted to claim them as soon as possible, apparently. After that, I ended up leaving the Capisi at the resourcing site. I'm not quite sure why. I decided to advance on two fronts without the Capisi on either. The Capisi is doing nothing. That's just a big waste. In this mission, my fears were realised. I remembered thinking, when it gave me the artillery cruiser, I was like, this is really powerful because it shoots so far and it's just sort of like this passive, fire and forget, devastating weapon. It will be really annoying if the AI was using this on me, and in this mission, they are using it on you. So what that means in practice is you need to pay attention. You can't leave your units just parked somewhere because they might get killed from outside of their line of sight. And also, because of that as well, the enemy shoots cruise missiles at you, which is pretty much the same problem as the artillery. We take a massive hit on Rachel right there. Luckily, I've got support cruisers in the main group, so everything will just heal each other up there to full health. And then we might want to get on in there and try to find the enemy's artillery and kill it as early as possible. So, well, I guess this is the micro above macro thing I was asking for. However, what I don't understand looking back at my own footage is why I didn't commit to this enough. This is another moment where I kind of half engaged with the enemy. I've got about half my army back doing nothing near the resource areas, including of course the Capisi. I must have been paranoid that the enemy would make a major attack in that direction because they have the ability to do so. But really, this attack I'm making is going to draw all of their units over here, so this is the main fight. And we just don't have all of our stuff in the main fight, making it harder than it needs to be, so that's a problem. There's another cruise missile causing its own problems, not quite killing our artillery at the back there. Meanwhile, we are just driving forwards and we are taking artillery fire, so all we want to do here is just get them into range as soon as possible. Luckily, the enemy artillery tends not to drive away from you if you drive towards it, so you can just plow on in and tank all the shots so they don't shoot you too many times. Although that does involve getting shot by everything else, of course, so this is not an ideal engagement. Plus, the enemy cruiser, or enemy carrier I should say, is right here firing long-range missiles at us as well, plus it's launching strike fighters against us. It's doing all the stuff that I like to do against me. They've got the full suite of my powerful units, and they're using them against me in such a way that I'm not using all of my powerful units against them. For some reason, I've been tricked into sucking. This is all somebody else's fault. So we have that little engagement there, and then I start driving away because we've taken some serious damage, and I thought I'd like to go and sit in the corner for a bit. And why don't I bring my whole army over here anyway? We actually didn't take that many casualties. We lost like 5% of our pop cap or something in the fight. But that was enough to scare me off. I was like, this isn't going well enough. Let's try again another time. And there's the order to actually move the Capisi up and get serious about this. Perhaps that first wave is what some people will call like reconnaissance in force, or a probing attack, where you make a sort of half-hearted attack just to see what will happen, and then you make a real attack afterwards. So there you go, we can frame this as a real strategy, but in my own opinion, a probing attack was the wrong move. Just make an actual attack, because it should be possible to win, because it's a game where you're supposed to win. That's a very meta consideration to make, strategically speaking, but if you're supposed to defeat the enemy, you might as well just go all in, because you should win, and if you don't win in that situation, it's probably the game developer's fault, and you can complain about it on the internet. What I'm saying is that we win this battle, and as you saw, we won it in a very anticlimactic way, because once my main fleet got even slightly into range of the enemy carrier, we obliterated it without me even seeing what it was that took it out. I'm guessing the long-range missiles on the Capisi, plus the artillery was firing away. It would be nice if the sensor view showed projectiles like in Supreme Commander, so you could tell what units were attacking other ones, and showed health bars as well. Once again, I want all of the functionality of the main view put into the sensor view, and also vice versa. Did you see that? This person talking here gave themselves a name. Like, I don't even know who that character was. Another named character showed up to talk about what's going on. What they are talking about in particular is this orbital laser that was mentioned. What I believe happened, if I remember correctly, is that Jacob accidentally activated this orbital laser that's defending the thing. And that's why the Galcian haven't got the thing yet, even though it's really near their territory, because this laser's keeping everybody away. However, through collecting Jacob's research along the way and picking up the wrecks, we've worked out that we can actually take control of the laser, which will allow us to access the thing and then shoot at other people trying to access the thing. So essentially, Jacob is like the hero, or the real hero of the story, because if he hadn't sacrificed himself on that expedition to do this, the Galcian would have captured the thing and destroyed it, thus preventing us from discovering spaceflight or something like that. Like, that's the implication, that this is the only way for us to work out our real history, because this is, I think anyway, a mothership, like in Homeworld and stuff, that is sort of half buried in the sand here. You can't really tell because it's very buried, and well, if you hadn't played Homeworld, this would mean nothing. Like, again, the game's relying quite heavily on you knowing the wider lore of Homeworld to understand the implications of us fighting over this random square we found. Like, this is the primary anomaly we were searching for the whole time. It's just like a square of metal in the sand. Is that even worth it? Well, it is worth it if you know what comes of it later, I guess, and I feel like a little bit more could be given to you in terms of like our characters thinking this is significant and understanding why. We'll see a bit more of that in a second, of course. What we're doing right now is setting up some scanners around the thing, because we need these scanners to target our orbital laser. The Galcian are also here because they noticed us driving towards the thing and figured the laser must have been disabled, so they decide to attack at the same time, but little do they know we're about to be shooting the lasers right at them. First though, the scanners also reveal that there is more than just a box of metal sticking out of the sand. There's an entire lost civilization under the ground here, because this is where the original exiles who were punished to come to this planet lived, in this prison city of sorts. Although we don't know that, of course, and the game doesn't say that either. It just says we've discovered the first city, which was like a myth to the Coalition, I guess, but turns out we really are all descended from this particular city that was built a very long time ago. We still don't know why, but we might know why if we dig down and take a look. So this is pretty exciting for our people, although of course you can't tell from the way they're talking about it. There was a bit of emotion there as they realised that all of this stuff might actually be real after all. Maybe the enemy religion was real after all as well to some extent. Well, we'll get to that. What you have to do in the game is to defend this area for a bit. The enemy come at you first with this carrier, and well, you can see its health bar is already a little bit low. That's because you can freely fire the orbital laser for the rest of this mission. This is just like a cooldown ability where you just pick a point on the map to receive some damage. I actually don't have any footage of it firing once again because I always fired it, like in the sensor view, and didn't see it doing anything. This is partially because there's plenty for me to do, so I can't like give myself the little treat of watching the laser shoot things because the Capisi is being swarmed with units over here. Luckily it's kind of fine, like we've got the weaker units defending the Capisi, and then with the Capisi's own strength, that's probably enough to hold off the enemy army, but just sitting here, And indeed it is, so we do that. Meanwhile our good units are over here, having this very dodgy looking battle with the enemy where we've all been EMP'd. I'm guessing their carrier can deploy the EMP like we saw earlier in the game. However, so can we, so we also EMP their main blob of units here, and the two blobs are now just shooting at each other, being stuck. We're going to be unstuck first, and broadly speaking this fight goes in our favour. In fact, we're still pretty much pop-capped by the looks of things, so we are not taking significant losses. Meanwhile, the enemy carrier in the corner there is basically dead. I haven't really engaged it yet, but the space laser and our artillery just shooting off screen have really done all the work. Before, they could do their favourite tactic of driving their carrier into my carrier. Drive me closer, I want to hit them with my sword.jpg and such. Well, we kill them, and it's like, well, that was easy. Like, is this the final mission? What else you got? Well, it turns out they do got something else. They come at us with a bigger carrier. This is their super carrier, because their main army was waiting here, because they've been trying to get at this first city for a long time so they can blow it up, so that nobody else can have it. I think that's the implication. So there's now a new wave of attack, which actually goes almost exactly the same as the previous one. Like, they come in from the same direction, which is handy, so we don't have to reposition to deal with it. But I was clearly intimidated enough to drive away from their carrier as it advanced, and also we can skirmish with the enemy's advancing blob here, taking some more damage. But these fights tend to go in our favour because the enemy mix in some of the weaker units into their blob attacks, whereas our blob attacks are pretty much only strong units, meaning we tend not to lose any units, so we have more guns firing the whole time and the fight just goes well. But now we're getting ultra serious. I'm almost bringing over the whole army to fight the enemy's flagship there. Not quite though, because we don't really need to. Although the carrier, the Kapisi, is taking tons of damage. This is because the enemy supercarrier keeps firing really long-range missiles at us. And also they deployed a whole bunch of strike fighters and bombers. We took out the enemy's air force pretty easily because the Kapisi is surrounded by some anti-air things that will do the business. And of course we're doing the same thing straight back to them. We are chipping away at that health by just hitting them with millions of missiles, artillery strikes, and the odd laser from above. And again, we don't have footage of that. Here's footage of me telling the laser to fire, but after doing that it came to check back and see what's happening with the Kapisi. It's lost half its health, but broadly it's fine. And then we zoom back over just in time to not see the laser blow the thing up. So there you go, all that hype about a space laser. Just my luck, I was facing the other direction when it fired and didn't get to see it. The good news though is that the enemy's faction leader, or spiritual leader, or something, was on the super carrier and will now blow up, although there is enough time as it blows up for them to give us one last rant, saying that we'll be punished for this. Like, eventually when we try to leave, there's going to be trouble. And they are correct about this. Where is the lie? Although you wouldn't know it from just playing Homeworld Deserts of Kharak. There will be trouble. In fact, it's right at the beginning of Homeworld. You see the empire that's keeping us here. I think they're the Taidan Empire or something. It was actually mentioned in this game as well, what they were called. Something like that. Somebody shows up and completely nukes the planet into oblivion, if I remember correctly, right at the start of the next game, so right after this basically. And it was because we started building a mothership after discovering the mothership design and stuff about hyperspace travel, things like that, or quantum teleporting, whatever this game's science thing is for having faster than light travel. The point being, the Galcian were right. Going to space really did destroy Kharak. We do discover various things by uncovering this first city, as it explains here. Rachel now knows that we're all descended from this one group of people, the Kushan. But what we don't find out, somehow, is why they were here or why they can't leave. Like, this is the point when it feels like the Sajet should find out that the Galcian were right. Hashtag the Galcian were right, hashtag the Galcian did nothing wrong. And maybe we should see the Sajet being a little bit cautious about the idea of going to space. Although that said, you can't really do too much here because we are in a prequel, we have to recall, and this is a prequel that fits right up against the very beginning of the property it's a prequel to, so they really can't change anything about the timeline. Yes, we decided to go to space at the first possible opportunity, even though all those guys kept screaming at us, trying to stop us, and they were trying to kill us to stop us from doing it because they thought it would bring the destruction of the entire planet. And it does, like within the first 30 minutes of the next game. That's the real ending to Homeworld Deserts of Kharak. Everything went well until everybody died, but that happens just after the end credits, so don't worry about that. It has a very nice end credit sequence, by the way, the same kind of presentation as the original Homeworld, as I recall, so that's nice. What is this? This now is the skirmish mode in the game. Being an RTS, it's got to have that classic skirmish mode, although it's actually a little bit different to your classic skirmish mode, because it's like an artifact collecting race. It's a skirmish mode where you and the other team are trying to collect things on the map, and you have to find 5 things first. Although you can also play it like a traditional RTS skirmish, as in, just kill the enemy, because if you kill them, they probably won't be able to collect the things. It's master strategist Offid back at it again with the strategic insights. If the enemy die, maybe they won't do the thing. Yes, we can do something with this. Well, it's just interesting. You get like a slightly different way of potentially winning these games. In this game, I've just given myself an AI companion, so it's 2 normal AIs fighting, and I'm also here. And I was thinking I'll just sit in the corner and send strike fighters all over the map, because I can't be bothered to play properly. There is like a whole thing, like a tech tree, and build orders, and probably a whole meta associated with the skirmish version of Deserts of Kharak. There's also a 3rd faction that I don't remember any details about. It might even be the faction that the Sakala was supposed to represent. If I remember right, there's also a DLC for this game as well, which I don't have, I don't think, anyway, so maybe there were more missions, and that is where that other faction was coming from. Point is, there is this game mode, which you can also play, although I feel like the game is more about its campaign. I'm not quite sure, but at least to me, when I played the original Homeworld, I was like, this game is all about its plot. Like, the gameplay is just kind of normal, like it's decent enough, but it was the plot I thought was interesting, and that was what I didn't like about the game, the way it didn't use its plot very much, and just didn't give you enough information, I thought, about the plot. Like, it seemed really interesting, and if you look it up, like, on the wiki, it is. They just had all this material that they didn't use in the game. And that's exactly the same thing that I'm throwing at Deserts of Kharak. I've said that a couple of times already, but it is still the case. I had a really good time experiencing Homeworld Deserts of Kharak as a presentation. The game itself, well, it was okay. Obviously the main gameplay thing I didn't like is the whole resource collection thing that I ranted about several times, which the original got right, I thought, at least in my vague memory. But in terms of being just a normal RTS, it's a really good example of it. It has really neat controls, like sensible hotkeys, being able to do things like the Bandbox attack orders that I talked about earlier. It's really intuitive and easy to use and powerful, like it combines all of the good things. It reminds me of when I was talking about StarCraft 2 recently. I was saying something along the lines of, this game's skill ceiling is so high because it's hard to input the orders. Like, it's not necessarily difficult to think of what to do. It's hard to use the hotkey system and use what orders you are allowed to give to make the thing you want to happen. And I felt the opposite about Deserts of Kharak. I felt really in control the entire time, which was really nice. So I think it's a really good RTS, almost hidden within the fact that it's a very small scale, short game that, I don't know, just again feels like it has so much potential, both in terms of gameplay and in terms of plot, really. I think that's what I'm saying here. I liked a lot of things about the game, but I felt like there was more. There was more to access in this game. It should have gone further. We needed more variation in the gameplay in the campaign. We needed more of the campaign. And along the way, more of the Homeworld Deserts of Kharak aesthetic and experience and all that stuff. And maybe at some point, give the character a name as well. Like, go absolutely wild in terms of your writing and your presentation. You can throw in their name. Don't be afraid to do that. Is that too much information? Someone kicks down the door and says, no, show, don't tell. Don't write their name on the screen. That's telling. That sort of thing. Well, if you know me extremely well, you know I'm very anti-meta when it comes to writing as well, so I'm absolutely fine with just telling instead of showing. Just actually tell me a bit of information, because that would make the stuff you did show me more impactful, I think. Like, a whole bunch of plot stuff happened in this game, but it was so tangential. It's so like, oh, so that guy betrayed us, huh? That guy with no name who, like, we never met betrayed us. Oh no. You could have told us a little bit more so that we could care, that sort of thing. Yes, it's Offid failing to wrap up another commentary as I'm trying the carrier melee strategy by the looks of things in this skirmish. We're going to drive right at him and just get things going. This looks pretty cool. Looks like here I can really treat myself to looking at the graphics, the sort of thing you just don't see in the campaign because you're probably busy doing something else. If you've got a skirmish mode going that's so easy you don't need to pay attention because the AI is doing half the work, you can look at the game. And it's a good thing to look at. Again, that's something else they could potentially include more in the game, but that's a much more difficult thing. That's the whole Total War problem as well. where the game needs to look good for marketing purposes, but when you play it, you just don't benefit from it. So it's kind of like all that art went to waste to some extent, because while it made the company money, the actual consumers didn't really get to see it in the end. Oh well. I thought this game was good. I thought I could have tolerated it being longer. That's another massive off-ED accolade to stamp onto the game. Could have been longer and I wouldn't have been mad about it, so that's pretty good, huh? And I thought many aspects of it were unique and cool. I don't know if this franchise is dead or something. It probably is, because people probably hated this because it wasn't set in space or something like that. I thought this was a very reasonable entry. It feels like a kind of lower budget RTS game, the sort of game that people always wish existed, like, more generally in the gaming sphere, like A games instead of your AAA games, just decent games that are 15 hours long and provide a unique experience with some sort of directorial vision behind them, and this felt like something like that. Therefore, I'm going to claim that this game was good and put myself out there because I expect people also like to claim this is bad or it killed the franchise or something. I could very much see myself playing more of this game, and they could even make more land-based, Homeworld-like games, and I'd be like, that's fine, like I don't care about the space aspect anymore, even though I'm a space loser myself. I don't know what I'm talking about, of course. Let's get out of here. Thanks for watching this Homeworld Desert of Kharak commentary, where of course I had some very strong and important points to make that have been put across completely fluently. I think this is a very meta point because, like Homeworld, there is a lot of depth to the material that I'm trying to present to you, but I've only presented it at a surface level, so you don't understand how clever my points really were. There we go, we've tied it all together, let's get out of here. Next I'm playing Warhammer 40k Mechanicus, a turn-based tactics game that I had all kinds of crazy rants about at first, and then after playing it a bit more I was like, maybe I don't care about those things I was ranting about, maybe it's fine. Clearly I've got some cooking to do to come up with some more rant points to make about that game, so look forward to more high quality commentary coming soon on the Off-ED Game Grounds channel, or is it Gaming Grounds? I literally don't know what this channel's called. That's how haphazardly we're making these videos. It's a miracle anything actually gets uploaded at all. Praise the gods. Don't go to space or the gods will kill you. I'll see you next time.